Excellent. Okay. I need to get Mark to give me some acting like peanut butter, watermelon, watermelon, whatever they do to limber up. Welcome to Level Power Podcast, the podcast completely dedicated to your self empowerment. I am Mark Gleason, excited to be in the studio today, here with my co host Rick Rapetti. And we have as our guests Mark Pellegrino, star of stage and screen, and like me, a proud non academic. And then we also have James Lindsay, the hoaxer that started it all, mathematician, author, cultural critic, here to support Professor Rapetti in all things academic. So this is going to be an academic versus non-academic cage match. We also have joining us Niaz Mosharraf and Mike Sue from the Other Half podcast, who are joining us today, and they'll be helping us field questions and query our intrepid guests. So with that, Mr. Rapetti, would you like to say a few words in intro?
Yeah. So you may recall, James, that we reached out to you around the time of the election, wasn't it,
Yeah.
Mark?
Yep.
Yeah, about around the time of the election, we were hoping to get, some of your words of wisdom about what was going on then. We managed to get Mark Pellegrino, I think like a week before the election,
Yeah.
right, onto Level the Power to talk about it. But we've been playing kind of phone tag with you, James, ever since, and a lot has happened since then. So we're really excited and happy to have you here. In fact, at the time when we invited you, it was through Level the Power podcast, which is Mark's primarily his podcast, but I'm his co-host on there. I've been on there so many times. He invited me to be his co-host. I recently started my own, which I've been wanting to do for the longest time. I call it Philosophy to the People. And we've only had a couple of episodes of that. Mark Pellegrino was on both of them. So we're really excited about this. But we also had Niaz, who's a former student of mine at City University of New York, the belly of the beast. But he's also trying to do what the rest of us on this call are doing, which is just kind of raise consciousness and help, enlist, soldiers in the war against woke. So I think that's a good way of discussing the other half. He's like the other, we don't hear the other half, so that's why they named the podcast The Other Half. But Niaz, you want to take a minute to just say something about your new podcast? I'm really happy to have a former student that I could help out who's on the team.
Thank you. That was a pretty precise introduction for us. My buddy Mike and I have been pretty annoyed and just getting frustrated seeing everything that's going on in our society today, and especially online. I mean, that's why I started following Mark Pellegrino's The Guardian Project about the bullying that happens. It's just if you speak your mind, and seems like everyone is just in this circle of this battle pit of hypersensitivity, and you can't actually open and discuss ideas reasonably or with a common goal of coming to an understanding. So we wanted to open up the platform to speak to people from all walks of life, and just give them an opportunity to express their opinions and have a discussion without killing each other. That's why we want to show the opinions of the other half.
Great. I'll say one more thing, and then I'll hand it back over to Mark Gleason over here. Maybe we should just say Gleason and Pellegrino to keep things simple. So this is, we're happy to have two high-profile guests here, Pellegrino and James Lindsay, and we want you two guys to be like the prime, focus of this podcast today. So the rest of us are kind of supportive, and we'll chime in here and there and ask some questions just to make sure everything keeps moving along. But so we have a couple of questions that we wanted to come in with, but then we're just going to kind of play it by ear. We've got Niaz and Mike monitoring the chat, and he'll be curating some of those questions for us and letting Gleason know which ones are good, and then Gleason over here might pick a couple of them if we have time. We make no promises to the people following along and submitting questions in the chat box because we've only got about 90 minutes of James's time here, so we want to honor that. So
Well, very good. Well, so then to open it up to our guests, so maybe quickly we'll go to Mark Pellegrino. Mark, we've spoken a few times before. You're another kind of person on the front lines of kind of combating woke culture, cancel culture, people coming after you for some of the things you say. And we've talked before about James Lindsay and his books, how he's out there fighting. And maybe you could just kind of give a few words on that, because I know that you're kind of a fan. At least that's what it sounded like to me. And then we can throw it over to James for an intro.
Yeah, I mean, I like most people found myself slightly puzzled at the radical skepticism I was seeing out there. And even though I'm an objectivist and have a pretty good sense of how to combat it, I still felt I was losing ground. And I was even skeptical. Peter Boghossian, whom I know, was saying, look, this thing that's coming out of the universities is the monster that we have to fight. I was skeptical about that. I thought it was something else. But as I began to fight with people and hear the language, hear the same words repeated over and over again, these key words, these turning point words, I began to see that they all had a common source. And so I decided to start reading stuff that James wrote. And plus I saw James on social media. I'm like, oh my God, this guy's amazing. Listen to the stuff he's saying. And he's got cojones the size of Texas, Tennessee, wherever you want to say. But I thought this guy's fighting, and he's winning. I mean, these academics are trying to fight back, and they just got nothing to stand on. So I went and I started reading his stuff and his program, New Discourses, which I think is great. I listened to your whole reading of Herbert Marcuse's repressive tolerance, which I thought was a fantastic analysis, and it's given me ammunition to go out there, and I'm now familiar with the words that they use, the language that they use, and the way they manipulate language, so that I could do a form of intellectual jujitsu on them in a way, and I think it's been very valuable. I think James is a great source of information. He does all the scholarship for us, so we don't have to think as hard, because he's been doing it for us, and he's got some, I think, just incredible thoughts that are, I think, our main source of ammunition for fighting this thing.
Well, very good. Well, I think that is an excellent intro then for James. He reads all the woke papers, so you don't have to, I think is a valuable service. So Mr. Lindsay, welcome to the program. Any few words you'd like to say for yourself in introduction?
No, that was pretty humbling to get to hear. So I think that did a pretty good job. I also write the woke papers, so you don't have to, I guess. I could say that.
You write it so they don't have to.
Well, I mean, that's true. I could save them a lot of work if they would just shut up very kindly. I'll write the papers for them. It'll be great.
Well, that's one of the questions that we actually had was, I guess maybe could we do a brief background just for the audience on postmodernism, and this is a philosophy podcast. We've covered that topic before, but for people who aren't really familiar with it,
chapter 1, James, chapter 1.
Yeah.
That's right. So, and by the way, people always say to me, well, you do philosophy or you read philosophy, but so what? I mean, there's just a bunch of ideas. They don't really mean anything. And of course, that's true in that exact moment when it's in a cafe and people are just yelling ideas at each other, but those ideas have consequences. 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road, ideas have consequences, real world consequences, and so very early on, people were fighting this postmodernist menace on kind of just philosophical grounds, on principle, and it really wasn't having an impact. So it was hard to make people care, and at some point it began to turn, right? And I think academia was the first place in universities that you really began to feel it. So perhaps you could just give us a background on when was it that you kind of sensed that things were going wrong or something was amiss, and when did you decide that this postmodernist premise was kind of part of the issue?
And could you also just briefly for the audience, not everybody's up on all this stuff, say what postmodernism is?
That's right.
Like a one paragraph at most summary of chapter 1?
Yeah, let's summarize a huge artistic and stylistic and philosophical movement that refuses to have a definition applied to it in any regard whatsoever in a paragraph. See what we can do.
Well, that might be
there
good
are a
enough.
lot of dimensions of postmodernism, so I'll try to simplify it down like we did in chapter 1 and say that postmodernism, in terms of how it's become applied in the world that we're facing kind of starts with a particular thesis we call the postmodern knowledge principle. So it's a way of viewing the relationship between knowledge and power, or knowledge and culture, or knowledge and society. That's not all of postmodernism. The philosophers will get mad, but we're going to focus on this one aspect. It's a very Michel Foucault aspect of it. And the general claim there is that if you want to make a claim about the truth, then you have to somehow have gone through some political process or social process that gives you the authority to say something is true. And so we shouldn't care as much about whether or not that statement is actually true or false. We should care more about the process that gave you the power to convince people that it's true. And so that's what's known as the social constructivist thesis. So it is the idea that knowledge is a product of the culture or the social order in which it's embedded, and that we have to question that social order and the power dynamics that hold it up in the hierarchy within it, instead of caring about whether or not statements are actually true, which is a rather profound thing. We could talk about other aspects of postmodernism. I don't talk about it a lot in Cynical Theories. John Baudrillard's Desert of the Real, for example, and this idea that we now occupy hyper reality where we're fed images that are more real than real. This is another aspect. We could talk about Jean-Francois Lyotard's idea that all these big stories we tell ourselves, the meta narratives is what they call them of society, we should be very skeptical of those, that all things that we believe are legitimizing statements of truth are actually processes of consensus. So we're just agreeing to go along because lots of other people who have power and status say we should go along. And when we look at what's going on with COVID and the policies around COVID, there's a lot of moments where you're kind of like, they really did have a point about some things. So that's, I guess, a paragraph and a half brief introduction to the impossible task of defining postmodernism. Most important is the idea, though, that knowledge is a social product. It's not actually making statements that refer in any meaningful way to what is true in reality. It is rather statements about reality that people agree because of some social and political process to treat as though they're true, which makes them very powerful sentences. So we should then interrogate the power dynamics that lead to being able to make those statements, because that's how power flows in society. So this is, I guess, a decent nutshell version of what's going on there.
The power to convince, that was one of the expressions you use, and I guess that is extremely interesting, right? That the focus is not on what is true, it is on what we can convince people is true.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like believing that everything is on a level propaganda, and then starting with that premise and then trying to work out, who does this knowledge claim serve? That becomes the more interesting question then, is this knowledge claim true? Who's benefiting from believing that this is true, or from this being treated as though it's true? So it treats knowledge statements in that sense. Who benefits here? And it's a very pessimistic and cynical and skeptical, radically skeptical approach to understanding the world. That's for how I got into this. I did get into the fight before I realized postmodernism was a part of it, before I even knew what postmodernism was, as a matter of fact. I actually do remember it was either in 2012 or 13 when I finally realized that whatever's going on, because this culture war was kind of raging around a little bit already in 2010, 11, 12, in some of the circles I was running in, there was actually the precursor to a Me Too movement that happened, and it was all systemic sexism, keeping women out of organizations, keeping women out of speaking roles, keeping women out of teaching positions, etc. And, there was this whole vibe. It was all about systemic sexism. But I was having a conversation in 12 or 13, a couple of years after that, where I heard the conversation was about affirmative action and what it was doing to the workplace environment for blue collar workers of, whatever race, who felt like their bosses, their managers were diversity hires. And so a white guy, blue collar white guy, was explaining this, and another very educated white person spoke up and said, yeah, but white people's stories have been told. And that's when I realized something very bad is happening here. The ability to just completely dismiss some actual experience that somebody's trying to relay in good faith to try to have a circumstance better understood and maybe work toward a solution that he was identifying and others were identifying in the group as causing problems that were easy to identify and concerning, could just be swept off, excluded from discussion entirely, based on the fact that it was a perspective handed down from a person who happened to be white. And with the statement, white people's stories have been told. And I even interjected and said, well, the stories have changed. The stories white people would have told in the 1950s and 60s are very different than the stories that would be told now. And the reply was, no, white people's stories have been told. It's time to tell other stories. And I didn't even know that that is ultimately an idea that has roots in postmodern thinking, that different cultural groups have their own species of knowledge, if you will, that are propped up by the politics and then forwarded in broader society according to whose identity group or cultural group or political group or whatever has more power. It was probably not until, so that was 2012 or 13, I don't remember exactly when. It was probably not until 2016 that I realized that postmodernism itself was at the heart of this line of thinking. I didn't, I paid some attention to it and I looked at it at the time. I just said, this is a very kind of identity-based religion, and I kind of approached it like a religion or like a cult that was just absolutely obsessed with the idea of social justice and identity politics. It wasn't until, like I said, 2016 or so when we started actually looking at the academic literature, where I think you said, you started to realize there's Mark, that there's a common root to all of this. Well, that we had that realization, I think, in about 2016, myself and Peter Boghossian in particular. We had a very weird conversation a little before that, where we said that we were talking about how it operates kind of like a religion. And one of the points that we raised in the context of it operating like a religion was that the academic literature in fields like gender studies operated like a scripture. And so we were looking at it through that angle and started to investigate that academic literature. And we started to notice undeniable patterns in that literature, which led us then to start writing the fake papers that you alluded to, or I alluded to as well. And then eventually led us to deciding to really get to know what's going on here, because this is a much more concerning problem than people realized. We thought, of course, it was just this weird, silly, stupid, a bunch of academics have lost their way and it's influencing some policy and it's bad and we should, try to fix that. We didn't realize that this was actually a possible civilizational threat until we got about halfway through the grievance studies project and started to see how peer reviewers were responding to some of the ideas that we thought were just beyond the pale, in particular thinking that we hadn't gone nearly far enough.
So can I ask a question about that? So I had read years ago, and Rick, you can weigh on this as well, that every library or every college and university has to buy certain kinds of journals. So if it comes out, then they buy it because they need a record of it. And therefore, maybe 10, 15 years ago, there were people putting out kind of, not fake papers, but they were generating these academic journals and then just generating content with all of these kind of throwaway papers that never get cited. And
Concept laundering, as you called it, James.
and it was kind of
Idea laundering.
Oh, idea laundering, right.
And that's
sorry.
Brett Weinstein's term, actually. He gave that to us.
so it was this kind of leftist academic, let's generate some money, low levels of money, but still, we'll generate this money by generating papers. Everybody has to buy it. Was that, I remember reading that 15 years ago and saying that's why all these idiotic papers are coming out, because people are getting paid some low levels of money to do this. Is that part of this and that morphed, or is that just a byproduct? I mean, somebody had to start writing all this stuff. This is a lot of work that started off for no other reason than, were they all true believers? Was it a money-making scheme to start? I mean, how did all this begin, I guess is my question.
I'm willing to bet there's a symbiotic relationship between those two things that was going on. But were they all true believers? The people who were writing this stuff in the 90s were activists. That's it. And activists are usually true believers, and in fact, they're frequently lunatics. And they have the zeal of a newly converted religious person. They dedicate all of their mind, all of their effort, all of their time to trying to preach the gospel of whatever their activism is based upon. And these were very zealous activists who, in fact, though, were inspired, going back to the 1960s, so that's much earlier than that, were inspired by writings of people like Herbert Marcuse, who had indicated that we needed an intelligentsia, a leftist intelligentsia within the United States that was operating in conjunction with, societal outsiders, mostly violent activists like the Antifa crowd today, and also with racial minorities, and by which he really meant the liberation movements, like the Black liberation, the women's liberation, the sexual liberation movements, and that they should be working together to form a coalition that would march into the institutions and start to and very much in the line of Antonio Gramsci's writing from the 1920s, to start to colonize from within and create a counter-hegemonic movement. And I noticed that this was happening, in particular, the most glaring, back right after the Grievance Studies affair came out in 2018, I got invited to read a book on critical nutrition studies of all freaking things. And it's telling the history and review it for a dietitian journal. And so I'm reading this, and it's telling the history, the story of where critical dietetics and critical nutrition studies came from. And the story is basically, you know, we started to write these very activist style articles. We submit them to dietitian journals. We'd submit them to nutrition journals, and we'd get told, we can't publish this. This isn't dietetics. This isn't nutrition. There's nothing to do with it. And so they started to create their own academic journals, because they could start publishing those online, or they could find a printer who would do it. And then if you can get to the point where you can get a significant journal, these academic journal publishing companies are, and this is well known to academics, some of the most corrupt corporations in the universe. I know zero academics who think that the academic publishing racket is anything other than a gigantic racket. It is a horrifically corrupt industry. So if you can get, you know, you get 3 years of your little crackpot critical nutrition journal running, then you can get somebody like Sage or Taylor and Francis to pick it up. Now all of a sudden libraries are going to pick it up because it's under their imprimatur, and then it's going to get tied in with whatever, you know, library deal that they have. And now all of a sudden you have this in university libraries, and it's in what look like real academic journals. And it's becoming the justification for having courses and books and scholarships and fellowships and endowed chairs eventually down the road. And this was exactly that same colonization of the academy approach that the New Left was advocating, following Marcuse, who had watched Mao, listened to Rudy Deutschke talk about the Long March to the Institutions, and who had read Gramsci and seen the need to install within the different cultural institutions of society a counter-hegemony that would tear apart the existing Western hegemony and make room for a revolution. So I call this the iron law of woke corruption. I've got 2 iron laws of wokeness now. The iron law of woke projection is the other, is that usually if they tell you something, they're projecting. If they accuse somebody of something, they say Tucker Carlson is a racist, they're telling you that they're a racist. If they say that this reminds them of genocide, you better watch out. Iron law of woke projection. But we've also got the iron law of woke corruption. So you start talking about these kind of like little grubby money-making schemes and these, you know, for publishing and getting things in libraries and whatever. Well, on the other side of that, you have them creating bogus expertise, bogus status. I'm trying to think of another word that's not going to come to me in time.
Credentials.
Yeah, credentials. There we go. That'll do. So yeah, bogus credentials that elevate themselves as purveyors of knowledge. It's really funny because we just talked about postmodernism and that political process that needs to get interrogated. And what I see these people as having done is seen these arguments within the postmodern literature and said, how do we, rather than reading this as a warning, which is actually what people like Foucault and Derrida and Baudrillard were doing, a description and a warning of what Foucault in particular, it's not that everything is bad, he wrote, it's that everything is dangerous. So he's giving a warning about the ability to manipulate power and knowledge this way. And these activists picked this up and were like, great idea, you know,
Yeah.
Let's run with it. Let's weaponize this.
Yeah,
and
on
that's,
that point, James, can I interrupt? You
yeah,
said
please.
most of the activists are true believers, but what about those who read Saul Alinsky's
Rules for Radicals.
Rules for Radicals? You know, some of these they're very cynical, they're manipulative, you know, they know exactly what they're doing, but then they're not true believers.
Yeah, what's the intersection, I guess, between this postmodernist movement and Saul Alinsky Rules for Radical Tactics? And it does make sense that if you say it boils down to the power to convince, then, you know, if everybody has a medical degree, then everybody is equally equipped to pontificate about their theories on medicine, right? So if you just flood the market with so much ideas and so many academic journals that you just water everything down, then it supports this subjectivist notion that who can know anything anyway? And there's so many experts saying so many different things, right? So, but you have this specific Saul Alinsky Rules for Radicals, and you're saying they're reaching back into the 60s. and I think you've commented on this before, but what is the intersection now between this? I mean, is it a perfect circle? Is the Venn diagram between rules for radicals and the woke movement kind of a perfect circle, or is there a departure at some point?
They've adopted a lot of the tactics. I think that they do it mostly subconsciously without realizing that they're using rules for radicals. It's very easy to paint up these radicals as very cynical operators, but in fact, they are true believers in something. They're true believers in leftism. They're true believers in the fact or the idea that capitalism or that liberal societies are catastrophes that need to be torn down, whether that's in an anarchist bent where they don't have an idea of what's going to replace it necessarily and don't care. They just want to tear down that which they think is bad and causing their lives to suck, or whether it's because they're communists. Those people are true believers in some version of communism that's evolved in some way or another. When you look at Marcuse, he started out as a communist and became a so-called liberationist, which is a much more vague and odd term. So I think they still are true believers in that regard, but they're not necessarily true believers in the specific theories they're peddling, right? Which is a different thing. They're true believers in something and see something like critical race theory as a means to an end. Now, I look at somebody like Kimberly Crenshaw, who's one of the creators of critical race theory, along with Derek Bell. And Derek Bell, I think these guys, one's a woman, but so we'll have to be careful with that these days. I think these two, I think they really do believe the stuff they say about race and racism. But I do think that there are a lot of cynical operators who have picked these things up, who are more interested in just breaking down a society that they see as corrupt and right-wing and evil and fascistic or whatever else. And so I think that the amount of sincerity in the majority of the people pushing the specific theories is probably very high. I would say that you would have, as far as the Venn diagram goes, you can ask the same question as what proportion of, say, religious leaders, pastors in a Christian context or whatever, are true, sincere believers, and how many of them are not. You look at a character like Joel Osteen, for example, and you're like, does he really believe all this prosperity gospel stuff, or is he smiling real big and making millions, and is it a scam? We don't have the privilege that they give themselves of reading minds and assuming cynical motivations.
Exactly. We call that motive whispering. We're not motive whisperers.
That's right. It's hard to tell. So I try not to tell. I do know that there are cynical operatives who are definitely probably not very deep in the true belief of this, but do see its utility. But a lot of those people are less theorists and more people who throw money at it, lots of money at it. And the another point that I make a lot, especially under this kind of iron law of woke corruption, is that when you have this kind of an ideology that's not based in something like merit or competence or some set of objective measures, truth, trying to get down to a rule of law that's removed from any particular individual or any particular party, then what you have is an open door to the kind of corruption that makes it impossible to tell if you have somebody who's a true believer spouting off crazy ideas or a grifter who's figured out that this is a road to power. As a matter of fact, I warn more deeply that because of the nature of essential psychopathy, or sometimes people will call it sociopathy, that you will end up in these kinds of situations where you have a truly psychopathic leader rising to the top. You got your Randy Macho Man Savage back in the day with his little half and half. The cream rises to the top. Well, the psychopaths rise to the top is what happens. And when you have these, and that's where you see characters like you have this whole movement coming up under Marxism for communism, and then who rises up? Lenin, a total psychopath. And then who supplants Lenin is Stalin, an even more psychopath. Who rises up as the Communist Party breaks down the existing order in China? Mao, total nut job. Psychopaths will rise to the top because they have certain advantages like not having empathy and maybe even enjoying cruelty that give them the ability to manipulate these bad ideologies to their own ends. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but it's scary.
I'm reading a book right now called The Riot Makers by Eugene Methvin. Have you ever read that book, James?
No, that's new to me.
Because he talks about Lenin being one of the first people to analyze sociology in a way and to understand that every crowd was composed in part of pathological human beings whom he could appeal to take control of the rest of the people in the crowd. And that was sort of the dynamic behind creating fomenting civil unrest. And then this was used in the 60s in various cities, organized people who took advantage of pathologies and incidents, just to, tinderbox incidences to create civil unrest. But I want to know a lot more about critical race theory and queer theory and the differences between them. But I want to ask you a question. Now, these ideas have been in the institutions for years. These people have been in the institutions for years, and it seems like suddenly this stuff has burst upon the scene. Can you tell us to any degree of reasonableness why? How has it come on so suddenly and so powerfully?
Yeah, I can. I'm going to actually speak for 1 second, though, about what you mentioned about the psychopathologies that these kinds of ideologies play upon. We're definitely seeing that. It is beyond question, for example, that the rape culture, so-called third wave feminism, was preying upon the vulnerabilities of young women going to college to make them more and more neurotic about the possibility of being caught up in a rape culture-based campus, to indoctrinate them or reprogram them into a very act to radicalize them into a movement of feminism that was, pretty strictly off the rails of reality. And you see the same thing with the kind of grooming where you're taking advantage of young people's insecurity about their body on social media platforms, especially very famously Tumblr, that would drag people into gender nonconforming and sexuality nonconforming or other alternative sexuality practices and trans issues. You see this within critical race theory, where you see them agitating around the idea that it's not your fault that you haven't succeeded if you're not succeeding and you're a racial minority. It's a system that's cooked up against you, and that rejecting that system is, it's not your fault. So now you can offload your frustration or whatever. But this plays in particular very well to certain cluster B personality disorders. Narcissism, which is already functionally not essentially on the rise because of the nature of social media. It plays into borderline personality disorder, people who are unstable and they want to break things. And it plays into schizoid personality disorder that's much more common with young women. And so you'll see that in both the feminist thing and within the trans thing that I was mentioning a moment ago. And it plays into that vein of resentment, or as Nietzsche put it, ressentiment, that more curdled envy that wants to, gain vengeance over the society that has betrayed it or that has held it down. It plays into these things. And so Lenin observed correctly. And what we're seeing, and this is why I've actually referred to wokeness as Leninism 4.0. It's the fourth instantiation of Leninism being attempted on the world. Lenin did the first one, Stalin did the second, Mao did the third, and now we're in the fourth one. And it is a bid to conquer the West with exactly the same strategies, exactly the same tools, although they're now tailored to the West, and they don't have the same outcome. We will not end up, I don't know about gulags one way or the other, I don't want to go into that, but we will not end up in a Leninist-style Soviet Union. The model now is based off of what Deng Xiaoping introduced in China following Mao, which is this fusion between communism and fascism, which is what they have now in mainland China. But that didn't answer the question that you asked me. That does tie into what you observe there is the dynamic now. And I remember back in 2012 and 13 and 14 talking about, this is some personality disorder driven ideology, and people would go berserk. You can't call people personality disordered. You can't say that. You can't diagnose people. People would go berserk. But it's, I think at this point, beyond any question that it's playing into and exacerbating and triggering and bringing out the worst in personality disorders, which then have almost superpowers online. They're very difficult to resist online because it's very much harder to see them. You see somebody who's actually got something wrong with them online, hiding behind an anonymous avatar, and they're just another reasonable person as far as you know. You don't know. It could just be some normal dad taking 5 minutes out of his day to send you some stupid message about his dumb beliefs, or it actually could be a psychopath who has literally broken psychology, a cluster B personality disorder, and you don't know. And so you treat people often online, we often talk about how we treat people with less charity online because it's faceless, etc. We often treat arguments with way more charity than we would if we saw the crazy eyes of the person saying them in person. So there is that aspect there. Now, how did this get out? How did it explode? Well, you just mentioned that too, really, Mark, what you said, tinderbox incidents and taking advantage of those. I think that I mean, it's been growing. First, let's acknowledge the idea of, I don't know if you're a gardener, but you got to prepare the soil, then you plant the seeds, and then the seeds grow. And the soil has been being prepared for a while by marching through the institutions, and in particular, the educational institutions. Critical pedagogy, which is the critical theory applied to the theory of education, had become pretty much dominant in education schools and colleges of education by the early 1980s. So we've been cranking out teachers who have been, drip feeding at least a little bit of like Howard Zinn and all of these kind of very critical, cynical, leftist takes on American history or whatever other subject into the educational mainstream all along. And these things have been slowly priming the field. You hear university administrators say that wokeness wasn't something they imposed from above, it was demanded from below. The students wanted it out of a call for safety. Where did they get those ideas, though? It was partly they were picking it up through whatever culture, television, movies, music videos, whatever it is that they're engaging with, their social media, how they engage with their friends, but also that they were picking it up through these kinds of school as sensitivity training, school as self-esteem boosting. Nobody's ever wrong, everybody gets a trophy, and look at all of these tragedies, and we're going to lionize everything that even vaguely looks like civil rights, and we're going to just completely take, they talk about not having nuanced conversations about issues of the ugly history, aspects of history of the United States. Well, I mean, they took it 100% the other way, and there were not nuanced conversations. Iron law of woke projection strikes again. So the field was prepared, and then I cite three specific phenomena, or not really incidents, but phenomena that mainstreamed this stuff very, very quickly. And of course, these have multiple incidents attached to them. But the first one was actually the election of Barack Obama. And whether true or not, because now I no longer believe anything I see on the media, and I did see some of this in person, so I do know, living here in the Southeast, that it did happen. But there was a bit of a right-wing reactionary racist response to the election of the first black president of the United States. And this was driven to, an extremely loud volume on the internet. Look how racist the South is. Look how racist Republicans are. Republicans and conservatives got very strongly branded racist. And this was, you talk about, preparing the soil. Now you have this whole idea that underneath it all, you have a lot of racist conservatives. And the critical race theory message in specific at this point, queer theory's over here fermenting into whatever on Tumblr and social media, weird corners of social media where you get to pretend to be a dragon or something. But meanwhile, out in society, you have this critical race theory narrative that, by the way, racism didn't go away. We're just as racist as we've always been. We have always been, and we've hidden it better. White people in particular have hidden their racism, and if we have critical theory of race, we can dig into that and get underneath it and see it again. And then so all this stuff kind of erupts around Obama's first election, and even his second election, it came up again. And all of a sudden there's like, see, look how racist America is under the surface. Then in 2013, so this is during Obama's tenure, we have the killing of Trayvon Martin, and the Black Lives Matter movement kicks off. This isn't really significant. It plays into the narrative until 2015, at which point Michael Brown, at the very end of 2014, was shot. And then the whole thing blew up through 2014 and 15, emanating out of Ferguson, Missouri. And so Black Lives Matter at that point was, I don't think it was originally a critical race theory movement around Trayvon Martin, but it was very quickly co-opted by these activists. And if you listen to the original people who started the Black Lives Matter hashtag and were doing the original activism around Sanford, Florida, and so on, you hear this. You hear, we had our movement, and then these weirdos came in, and they were probably heavily subsidized weirdos, came in and turned it into something different, and they're blocking streets, and they're doing all this kind of very radical activism. And so it was a year-long flashpoint in 2015, and of course it flashed again in 2020. But Black Lives Matter really brought into the mainstream a lot of this critical race theory, systemic racism line of thought. And you know that it happened then because in the 2016 presidential campaigns, primary campaigns, Black Lives Matter interrupted Bernie Sanders. They pushed Bernie Sanders out of the way and started saying the things that are now, daily occurrences, but nobody knew what in the world was going on. So Black Lives Matter was the second big kind of tinderbox mainstreamer. And then there was the campaign and media spectacle of the campaign and election of Donald Trump, which was framed as only a secretly racist, secretly sexist, secretly rape culture, secretly this, that, and the other thing, xenophobic society could possibly elect somebody like Donald Trump. And it happened. And so they had their proof to hand as far as driving the left narrative, the critical race narrative, into the mainstream right there. And everything Trump did or said for 4 years got framed out as being racist in one way or another. We elected a racist. We elected a rapist. We elected all these horrible things that justify their theories. And essentially, everybody who had TDS, Trump derangement syndrome, I count myself among them at the beginning of that, became very vulnerable. And that is the conditions under which an ideology can easily take root. So you have kind of a ground condition that's prepared the field. Then you have this series of incidents that kind of raise the profile of these ideas. They're getting more currency outside of the academy. Then Donald Trump gets elected, and the narrative got turned up to, a volume level of like 18. Racist. And everybody who had Trump derangement I remember I was in the exact same room I'm in right now the night Trump got elected. And I remember crawling out of the chair. It was a different chair than this one, though, and sitting in the floor and just having despair at like 4 a.m. And everybody was just screaming in their minds for an explanation. And critical race theory like slides on in and is like, we got one. And half of left America or more said, yeah, maybe America's way more racist than we thought. And all of a sudden, the mainstreaming of critical race theory took off. Then the actual, spark that you could say that's like spraying gasoline all over the ground. And then the spark that lit the flame was the death of George Floyd in the very end of May last year.
Excellent analysis. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very good. Did you guys have a question? Because I wanted to get into critical race theory. I want to hear about that and tell us about how critical race theory started and how it's evolving now, if you can, and what is this queer theory? Tell us where that fits into this whole mix.
Well, they're very different, but they kind of, forged together under intersectionality, but I'll see what I can do. So critical race theory arose originally in the 1970s with this guy, Derek Bell at Harvard Law. He had a couple of colleagues, most notably Alan Freeman. They're very cynical and pessimistic, looking back at things like Brown versus Board of Education, looking at the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, looking at all these things and saying, these didn't solve Black people's problems. And in a lot of ways, they made the problems worse. That was kind of their central thesis. And they, of course, were legal scholars looking at it from a perspective of law at the time. But what they actually said, their stated motivation was that they saw the enthusiasm of the civil rights movement waning, some 10, 15 years later. And in particular, what they meant is that the enthusiasm to continue affirmative action, support for affirmative action programs, and many of the very racially motivated Great Society programs that were essentially entitlement programs, the enthusiasm for those was waning. So they were trying to essentially wake up more enthusiasm to kind of like put racism, as Thomas Sowell put it, to put racism on life support so they could keep it going, so that they could continue essentially what amounts to a grift off of it. Not to question their sincerity. I think that they probably were quite sincere. Derek Bell, for example, wrote a book in 1992 called Faces at the Bottom of the Well, where he positioned the idea that Black people, no matter what, are the faces at the very bottom of the well of society. Every other group looks down on their faces, which was I can't get over this, because I was alive in 1992 and I was doing things in 1992, and I know I'm not trying to claim like, oh, here are some examples so racism is over. Biggest talk show host, Oprah Winfrey. I think she's the richest woman in the world at that point, even by 92. Most famous musician, Michael Jackson. Most famous sports players or sporting figures are across the line, almost all Black, but particularly Michael Jordan is at the top of his fame. He's playing like 9 professional sports or something in 92. And everybody I knew, white, Black, you name anything, had Air Jordan stuff. Like literally everybody I knew. I went out to dinner the other day and a guy was wearing an Air Jordan t-shirt. I was like, so that's in 2021. This is still a phenomenon. You know, top shows on television, Cosby Show, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, you know, kind of the fun rap and hip hop of the late 80s and early 90s is like the most popular music, or much of the most popular. I mean, it was just to say that this is the faces at the bottom of the well that everybody looks down on it's just in 1992 is almost just preposterous.
But I
So
mean,
this is
I mean, I don't mean to interrupt, but how in the world can an idea like that get purchased when it's almost self-evident that it's wrong?
that's a really good question, but I don't think it did get much purchase in 1992. There are articles written in the law review articles that were written in the legal literature in the late 90s saying, here's this weird thing, critical race theory. Here's a billion reasons why it's wrong, why it's kind of insane, why it's terrible, legal scholarship, whether it's really bad ideas. But it's just kind of confined to these weird circles in the academy. It hasn't really broken out. Nobody really cares about it. It doesn't really inform any jurisprudence or any actual, court cases until, of course, O.J. Simpson becomes the first critical race theory based criminal defense, and it was successful, obviously. And so there was not a whole lot of reason to believe that it was anything except this weird intellectual backwater of complainers who had every right under academic freedom to do what they were doing. Kimberly Crenshaw came along a little later in the 80s, by the way, and started fusing black feminism into what Derek Bell had already laid out. Kimberly Crenshaw was Derek Bell's student at Harvard Law and doctoral. I don't know if she has a JD. I don't actually know which degree she has, but was her advanced degree was under Derek Bell as mentor. And so she's actually the one who named critical race theory. She's the one who brought the postmodernism into critical race theory, following the black feminists who had picked it up already that she was associating with. And so critical race theory actually has kind of two huge domains, two huge directions. One is Derek Bell's very materialist. What are the material conditions around race and racism? How do those impact people? How do the laws impact? And then you have Crenshaw, who's all of a sudden about mindsets and attitudes and social constructions, and how social constructions of race are imposed upon people and what their consequences of those things are. And so then you finally have another prominent critical race theorist early on was Richard Delgado, writes a book called Critical Race Theory and Introduction. It's a kind of undergraduate level textbook, so it's a good place to start. It's still considered a cornerstone textbook in the field. And he describes, from the very beginning that the critical race theory is a movement that tries to recast the relationship between race, racism, and power. And it proceeds on a number of assumptions. One is a tremendous skepticism of the liberal order. They write in the first paragraph of Critical Race Theory and Introduction that it diverges from the original intent or the traditional approach to civil rights, and now instead that it favors questioning at the very foundations the liberal order itself, including ideas like equality theory, legal reasoning, which means rule of law, Enlightenment rationalism, which is thinking through things logically, rationally, or empirically, and then the neutral principles of constitutional law. They write a few pages later that one of their objectives is that they're highly suspicious of the liberal mainstay called rights, that rights are actually a problem. So this is kind of, you can see this is coming from a very bad and scary place already. They talk about some of the general underlying assumptions of critical race theory, some of which came from Bell, some of which came from Crenshaw, some of which developed in the kind of movement that they're describing. The first of these is that racism is the ordinary state of affairs. So that's Bell's faces at the bottom of the well, right? It's the ordinary state of affairs in society, not an aberration from them. We all heard of Robin DiAngelo now. She summarized that with a very simple statement in 2012 for the first time. The question is no longer did racism take place, but how did racism manifest in this situation? It's a core first principle assumption of critical race theory. Racism is there. You need a critical race theorist to find it. That's the core assumption, first principle, literally a first principle of the first principle of critical race theory. And other ideas like Derek Bell's interest convergence, that dominant racial groups or white people only help racial minorities when it's in their own self-interest to do so. In other words, if you look down the racial hierarchy, nobody ever helps anybody downward unless it's somehow to their own benefit. The interests have to converge. We're going to favor counter storytelling and narrative telling over empiricism and rationalism because those have been created in a white racial frame and therefore are embedded with the power dynamics of a white racial frame. That's a very much postmodern idea that has come into it at that point. The white racial frame is a cultural construction, and therefore now we're into that cultural constructivist thesis of postmodernism that we spoke about earlier. So these are the kind of very cynical and pessimistic views of critical race theory. That's really kind of where it came from. Now, we haven't touched queer theory yet. That's got a different history and trajectory. It's much more postmodern, actually, than critical race theory is. It came out of feminism picking up gender critical feminists at the time, which I don't think they even called themselves that yet, but people who wanted to argue that gender is a social construct. So they'd taken up some of the social constructivist thesis following people like Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote in the Second Sex that one becomes a woman, right? So that's 1949. So that's way before Michel Foucault wrote anything of significance. So they already have this idea that becoming a woman is a social process. And so the sex and gender are somehow different. And there is some difference between sex and gender. So this isn't totally crackpot, but they wanted to divorce them 100%, which turns out to be crackpot. And that opened the door to these theorists picking up this, like Judith Butler, for example, and Gail Rubin and Eve Sedgwick, picking up these ideas from postmodern thought and grafting them onto this social constructivist approach to feminism and just running wild. So where Judith Butler and Gender Trouble in 1990s now asking the question that maybe if gender is socially constructed, the sex must also be socially constructed. And so sex is not a biological reality that we understand, but rather it's something that's imposed upon us by social construction. And so one very literally becomes a woman. You perform enough womanly things and your body actually grows to be womanly as a result. If you do enough manly things, your body, it has nothing to do necessarily with the underlying genetics or hormones or any other such thing, which that's pretty out there. And then, they also were looking at the ways that sex and gender are separate from one another. And then also sexuality. How does sexuality interface with this? These are mostly lesbians, by the way. That were doing queer theory in the 80s going into the 90s. They also were picking up ideas off of Foucault where they were flirting with, well, what does it mean to have an age of consent? Isn't that just a socially constructed artifice? Maybe we should be talking about, not stigmatizing things like pedophilia. They're trying to open up basically every possible category within sex, gender, and sexuality to its broadest possible extent. And this is the idea behind queer theory. And there is, of course, a kernel of truth to this, that there are social expectations and norms around things like gender, sex, and sexuality. Be a man, try to be pretty. Why don't you smile more? All these kinds of things that people hear about, associate with sex or gender, or, you should be, don't be gay, or, whatever it is. There's these kinds of attitudes, these normative attitudes, do constrain and do end up imposing when they're too strictly socially enforced, or even worse, when they're legally enforced, like when there used to be legal prohibitions on homosexuality, or when it was treated as a psychiatric disorder that often resulted in, shock therapy, or sometimes, although not as often as reported in lobotomies and things like that. There is the possibility to create these abuses. And so there's this kernel of truth that, under a very strict or repressive, you can point to kind of a lot of these conservative Christian approaches to sex and sexuality and see that they're very repressive and that they constrain people and they hold people down. They wanted to break that open. They call breaking that stuff open queering it. They're making the categories, the idea that there are stable categories of sex, sexuality, and gender, questioning that at its very foundation and blurring the edges. So, if you have this very butch lesbian, why can't you say that, she's kind of more manly, but not by associating it with masculinity? That's not appropriate. Why can't you just say that that's an authentic expression of being a woman, which in some regard it is? And so you have these very imprecise categories, and then this very complex thing like sexuality, where on a level, somebody who is not gay can perform a homosexual act and perhaps even enjoy it while still not there's a great deal of flexibility and confusion and lack of clarity around things like gender roles, gender presentation, and sexuality. So they dive into this kind of fuzzy world, and then they start saying, society has created all of these these categories, and they try to force people against their will and against their own happiness into these categories. So we got to break these categories open. But the thing is what they're really doing is they're taking it to such a freaking extreme, and that they're so angry at the idea that there are categories at all, that they try to pathologize the idea of the normal and again reverse that hierarchy that you kind of constantly see in all of this. Oh, normal is good, abnormal is bad. Well, let's flip that over and make abnormal good and normal something that only a loser would want to be. You normies, right?
So that's where the term ableist comes in.
So ableism is in disability studies. Actually, ableism is the same idea applied to, ableism is a little more complicated because there's this concept of ableism that's related to the concept of disableism. Queer theory has heavily influenced disability studies. So a lot of the way that disability studies proceeds will do exactly what you just asked about. They'll see being normal in terms of, being a typical, all of your limbs, functioning body, no disorders that significantly impinge upon day-to-day life. As that being categorized as abnormal is just as stigmatizing and damaging, and therefore they're going to flip that over again. But disability studies has this idea that's, again, similar to queer theory because it borrows so heavily from it. In queer theory, the idea is that categories of sex, gender, and sexuality or normalcy are imposed upon people who don't necessarily fit the mold, and that creates oppression. And in disability studies, it's the idea is that society imposes upon people the idea that you should be a normal functioning person, and that's better than not being one. And so by imposing that, that's where disability comes from. They actually don't believe that disability has anything to do, like if I lost my arm, I can't call myself, or a leg or something, I can't call myself disabled. Or if I hit my head and had severe cognitive impairment as a result, I can't call myself disabled. It is society not accommodating this different aspect of being human that disables me. Society is the thing failing, not a crappy circumstance that I'm in.
Same thing with fat studies, right, James?
Exactly. Fat studies is borrowed off of that as well, and does the exact same thing with weight status or fat status. They use the word fat. They avoid the word obesity. There's no such thing as overweight because that would imply that there's such a thing as a correct weight, and that's not okay. Because the same exact thing is going on here, that society is imposing an idea of normal and expected and good, and that this oppresses people who fall outside of that range. And then they play upon, I don't think it's cool to bully people for being fat. I do think it might be reasonable to make some comments and get somebody a little extra motivation to go to the gym or eat better or whatever. But I don't think it's cool to bully people over it, right? Because you don't know what people are carrying. It's a complicated situation. You don't know if there's an underlying medical condition, or you don't know if something went wrong. My co-author in Cynical Theories, Helen, is she's losing a great deal of weight now, but has been a very heavy woman for a long time. And it is a result. You could say it's a lack of control or whatever on her part, and maybe things that could have been different. But it was a result of a medical condition and a drug that she had to take to keep things in order that caused her to have basically insatiable appetite, while also not possessing the coordination to be able to exercise. So weight gain isn't a guarantee there, but it's likely. And so, I don't think that people should be being bullied. This so-called fat shaming, I think, goes too far. Prodding somebody probably works out in people's best interest, but fat shaming is kind of rude. And there's this area there where where there's a very fine line between inappropriate and appropriate behavior. And what they do is they kind of just blow that wide open and make all behavior that anybody who's the most sensitive person in the entire world might not like, if they heard it, even if they were around, completely inappropriate. And because under, again, the social constructivist thesis, none of this is real, and it's all just how we're conditioned by society to believe. And then, people who are falling outside of these expectations or norms are harmed by these things. So that's, I guess, kind of a quick overview of most of the theories that we talk about in Cynical Theories anyway, where they come from, kind of what they are.
So can I ask, because they all have a common theme. Every con game has a common theme, and that is divorcing the truth from reality, right? Mm-hmm. Once, quote unquote, the truth is no longer pegged to any kind of objective standard, then deuce is wild, right? You can say basically whatever you want. And so, as a matter of fact, the first step in any cult is to get everybody to accept something which is obviously false, but say it's true. Because once you have that, you can lead them anywhere. But I heard this theory that in the 40s and 50s and 60s, the left, the communist left, were really trying to argue communism on the merits, right? You had a bunch of true believers going, this is the better way. A few Soviet generals said, let's just have a nuclear exchange, and communism is such an efficient system, we're going to rise from the ashes faster than those capitalists will. Of course, they could never even feed their own population, right? Even despite having Ukraine. But around the collapse of communism around the world in the 70s and 80s, the hardcore communists and leftists were getting laughed out of the room, right? Because they would still be in the universities trying to say no, but communism is good, and you start rattling off the list of things that just happened and how it's failed everywhere. They get laughed out of the room. So I've heard this a few places now where that was one of the moments that they decided to start pivoting truth. Okay, we're no longer going to argue the facts of reality. We're not going to say that communism outproduces capitalism or any of those things. What we're going to say is the truth is relative. That way we don't have to argue the facts at all, right? We'll just say that there's a different kind of truth. And there was this pivot, and that's where postmodernism and like communism kind of merged and roared through the 80s and 90s, building steam, saying there is no such thing as truth. There's only this social construction. So I just wanted to get your comment on that. How heavily do you think that's correct? Is that mostly correct? Is that kind of tangential?
No, that's to my guess, that would probably be somewhere in the 70 to 80% correct. I think it puts a little more intention behind what was going on with postmodernism than is actually there. But the activists who were picking up postmodern tools were still very much in this liberationist mold, and the liberationist mold was derived from the communist mold. So what you can actually read, it's very interesting to read. I actually kind of enjoy reading communists talking about Lenin or communists talking about Stalin. And they're telling everybody why those were horrible. You were talking about people who would have been writing primarily, and even now, but writing in like the those time periods that you were talking about, 50s, 60s, 70s. And then at the same time, though, like if you read Marcuse, you can hear him just kind of getting very upset about Stalin. And then at the same time, he's like, but everything's going great in China under Mao. That's a place to look. And the Cuban Revolution's looking good. And then eventually what happened is those things collapsed as well. My read on postmodernism is that postmodernism is properly and genuinely post-Marxist. It's a group of people in some sense who put all their eggs in the Marxist basket. They're watching Marxism. I mean, a lot of the postmodernists, in fact, were Maoists until that was no longer tenable. At which point, that's when they start writing their kind of most pessimistic, most questioning of truth kind of stuff. And so I think that they had all their eggs in the communist basket, which means they're already anti-West, they're already anti-liberal, they're already anti-capitalist. And so their idea fell. And so one possibility is to admit I was way wrong. Capitalism's still great, but their whole premise, being a communist, for most people that I can tell who are communists, especially later communists, after maybe 1960, what you see is very little ability to argue on the merits and a very large amount of ability to just complain about capitalism. So the idea that these post-Marxist French intellectuals are likely to say, well, capitalism maybe was the better way after all, versus everything sucks. Everything is bad. Every attempt to have the truth is a failure. They've just spent their entire intellectual lives arguing passionately, showing up in 1968, throwing rocks like Foucault did, at the Sorbonne. They've spent their entire intellectual lives saying that Western liberal democracy and capitalism is a pack of oppressive lies. And now they're like, well, communism is a pack of oppressive lies too. Everything's a pack of oppressive lies. And so I think that to say that, this is how the Marxists were able to then just run wild, puts too much intention behind the postmodernists. I think they actually entered into a phase of just absolute societal despair. Then, though, the neo-Marxists never quite went away. That's the activists we've been kind of referring to again and again, the critical theorists. The neo-Marxists never quite went away. And they still had their dream of achieving the liberated utopia. And these liberation fronts were often usually just, attempts to create some new, not as Marcuse puts it, some new non-bureaucratic socialism. They're going to create a non-bureaucratic socialist utopia. That's what the problem was, is that Stalin made it bureaucratic. If you just get rid of the bureaucracy, everything will work out this time.
Exactly.
I'm not kidding.
No,
That's
lots
what
of
they
them.
argue
A
for.
lot of them are still saying that all the time. Whenever you try to argue with them about capitalism versus communism or socialism, it wasn't
Yeah,
really those ideologies. It was the players and the way they set up the institutions.
No, that's exactly right. You know, they came in as a bourgeois vanguard and they set them up with bourgeois values that ultimately
Yeah.
corrupted them, and they set up the hierarchy such that, you know, it would reproduce the wrong values, and ultimately what that resulted in was creating a gigantic bureaucracy, and that bureaucracy just reproduced, you know, another kind of failure. That's the rationalization that they provide, and that's the thing that when Marcuse writes in 1969 in his essay on liberation, which I intend to do a podcast about, a series about on New Discourses sooner or later, when he writes in there, he's talking about we need to have socialism, but that socialism, when I talk about liberation, it's going to be a socialism without bureaucracies. And so,
Regulate all behavior with no bureaucracy.
yeah, exactly, right? It'll work out perfectly. What could possibly go wrong?
Once you've remade the soul of man, of course.
That's
you can
right.
probably
We
do
just
something.
need a new man.
It seems
Well,
to me that
that's in that essay too, by the way, that man has to be remade biologically to be suitable for liberation because he's currently not.
Well,
seems-
who was it that
seems to
said
me-
that communism is great, but just wrong species? You know, it's great. Communism is great for ants. It's just not for humans. Wrong species.
That's good.
It seems to me that there's two types of liberation movements. There's a liberation movement of liberals, which is to be liberated from force and from arbitrary authority. And then there's this other liberation movement. Every time I hear you talk about these postmodernists, critical race theorists, queer theory, is to be liberated from conditionality, from like the fact that reality is what it is, that your mind is what it is, and that we function a certain way.
That's right, and to be liberated. When you read Marcuse, you get the very strong impression that what his objective is to create a liberated world where what you're liberated from is responsibility.
Yeah.
You get all of the benefits of a completely free society with zero responsibility. There's absolutely nothing that's coming in and stepping in and causing you to have to do something you don't want to do. So there's no responsibility necessary. Of course, he's also talking about being free of the heteronymous interests. So you can't have a boss. He might tell you what to do. That's not necessarily responsibility, but unless it's trying to keep your job, depending on how you want to frame that. But he doesn't. There's not going to be any marketers trying to confuse you and convince you want things you don't really want. This kind of stuff. But that's kind of how he frames it. It is. You see Michel Foucault talking about his goal was to expand the potentialities of being. The limitations of being human, the limitations of moral structures have to be transcended. We have to get beyond, you look at queer theory, we have to get beyond biology, because biology is a terrible, oppressive way to think about what's going on with our bodies and our lives and our sexuality and who we are and who we're going to be. There is a very much a theme of this. And then in critical race theory, they aren't trying to get away from race whatsoever with their favorite social construct. What they're trying to do is reorder the system so that there's no responsibility for people who are in oppressed categories. They have no responsibility for any of their problems. They have no responsibility for any of their income. That's just going to be provided through reparations. And they're going to be able to be forwarded into important positions and status and power and money because they have been oppressed and therefore have a unique perspective to offer through storytelling that we should just basically elevate to the top of society. So you are correct. There is this desire to be liberated from that. And there is actually, this is the insidious thing that they always do is this is why it's such an effective parasite on left-leaning thought, is anywhere you have a movement like liberalism that is actually seeking liberation from supremacy, liberation from caprice and arbitrary law, under kings, for example, anywhere you have this where you're actually seeking something, in a liberal fashion for an expansion of freedom, you're going to find these neo-Marxist types grafting themselves onto that with a different definition of the key word. And that is their game. That is a game that they played. Bella Dodd talks about that. The Communist Party defector talks about that in her testimony to the House Committee on Un-American Activities in 1953. If you haven't read that, it's I don't know, 90 pages. It's worth reading. And she talks about how, when communism comes, it's going to come in very high-minded sounding terms. So it'll say that communists are against fascists. So communists are anti-fascist. So if you're against communism, you must be pro-fascist. And you think, who would fall for that? And then you look at the city burning outside your window and you're like, everybody, apparently. Like you had that argument 50 times on the internet last month, like still. And, so this is what they do. They graft onto these kinds of concepts. And there is, liberalism, and you actually, by the way, have a reactionary movement on the right that perceives this and then takes the wrong step and says, oh, well, this is just kind of like liberalism one step further, rather than it's like liberalism with a parasite, that liberalism needs to adapt to figure out how to be parasite resistant to this particular parasite. They say, no, it's the inevitable consequence of liberalism. Of course, these same reactionaries miss the point that, many of the things that they claim are the answer are not the answer. Like, oh, we need strong institutions of faith. Well, you can look under the Russian Revolution that many of the strong institutions of faith went Leninist before Lenin made them, because it was like the high status thing to do. They parasitized onto the idea of where social status was going to be had. And you have a lot of these strong institutions of faith that bent the knee willingly ahead of time so they would have the high social status. Same thing's happening now. You look at the Catholic Church, we have a freaking Marxist Pope. You look at the Southern Baptist Convention in 2019 passed a resolution to bring critical race theory and intersectionality into its analytical framework by name. They have a number of high-ranking professors at their seminaries, the most conservative religious seminaries in the country, who are critical race theorists, openly critical race theorists. We just had one named Jamar Tisby who teamed up with Ibram Kendi specifically, and you still can't get half of the Southern Baptist Convention to call this out as ridiculous or what it actually is. So what's going on is we have a line of thought that's extremely good at creating, I mean, I said parasite, but a viral model is actually even better. They got their little spike protein. They know exactly which receptors to attach to. And if liberals don't know how to guard those receptors, which are, people want to look scholarly, people want to look informed, they want to look smart, they don't want to look stupid, people want to look nice, they want to give maximum charity to every argument, they don't want to be considered a bad person, they don't want to get wrapped up in something that looks like a big moral evil, and they exploit these kind of receptor sites with their little ideological spike proteins and infect institutions and infect individuals and cause them to become creators of more of the virus, more of the mind viruses. So like Harvard University is basically like an infected cell factory right now, just pumping virus out into our society everywhere. CNN, that's a little bit uglier of a situation. I think they're just propagandists for hire. And then you have the New York Times.
Is that why you tweeted Harvard is a clown university?
Oh, I'm coming for Harvard. Yeah, Harvard is a clown college now. But they completely caved because this ideology purports. It's basically they purport to be on the right side of history, and if you're against them, obviously, therefore, you're on the wrong side of history. No one ever stops for 5 seconds to realize that this relies upon an assumption, a core assumption that history is progressing according to some trajectory, and there's a good side and a bad side to that trajectory. That's called historicism. That's what the dialectical materialism of Marx was based in, is the same exact concept. Nobody stops to question the entire premise behind a right side of history at all, rather than the history as, the series of human events as they transpired. No, now there's the moral arc of history bends towards justice. Of course it does.
It's a projection of the norms into the future, idealized, and which retroactively justify us doing whatever we can to get us closer to utopia, which is pretty scary. It's metastasized. It's like the pandemic. I mean, it's just amazing how quickly it's taken over, large swaths of the institutional world. It's scary. So on that note, I wanted Niaz. He had a good question about. Let
me jump on the virus thing real quick, though, because a law of epidemiology is that viruses mutate down, and whereas this is now metastasized, as you say, it's also mutated. We're talking about what do we got? Double mutation strains of COVID or whatever now. Well, this is mutated into literally the stupidest thing in the universe. No sophistication, right? So
Yeah.
in a sense, it's extremely virulent, but it's also become so transparently stupid that people, once it actually starts to impact their lives. I recently traveled and talked to some very down home people, just normal people in like Ubers and whatever as I was getting around, and it was just like, holy crap, these people don't buy like these people wouldn't buy the first premise of any of this academic nonsense.
But
They're
James,
like,
so
it's
many
clearly
people,
racist.
but so many people are afraid to open their mouths.
That's right.
That's the
That's
thing.
exactly right.
I told Mark Pellegrino last time we were on a podcast. I've mentioned this a few times. Even my colleagues at the university, I'm in the belly of the beast. A few of them will sheepishly come up to me near the Xerox machine. Well, that's when we were on campus, and say, "Oh, Rick, we love what you're doing. Keep up the good work." Because I open my mouth about this stuff, but they won't do it in public. So the whole thing is very scary, and like everybody's afraid of being canceled. So Niaz came up with a good question for you. It's related to Douglas Murray. Niaz, you want to ask him that one, please?
Thanks. This is all amazing, by the way. Thank you so much, James. I had a couple of questions earlier, but I was just captivated. Thank you. I was reading a couple of reviews on Cynical Theories, and so Douglas Murray wrote a Times review where he said that this was one of the very rare and good summary of postmodernism evolution from the 1960s. And this deconstruction of the deconstructionists may have arrived just a moment too late. And I wanted to ask you, why do you think he feels that way? Or not that you can say, but what do you think he means by that? And do you feel that this came a bit too late? The realization that this was happening right under our noses, or has been happening for so long.
Yeah, can we turn it around? What do you think, James?
Yeah.
How do we stop it?
So this is James. What keeps you up at night? Like literally, why do you wake up several nights a month, or even now almost at least one night a week, in like a PTSD sweat and racing heart and panic half the night? That's the question. So is it too late? Now I wrestle with this. I know why he thinks that, because it does look like it may be that we've lost too many significant institutions too far to be able to turn it around. I don't know if that's true or not. I think we will see the discrediting of many very major institutions if we do end up turning things around. People are waking up much faster than I expected, however, and they are starting to take a stand much more quickly and loudly, thanks to the courage of some few who stood up earlier. That's faster than I expected. And from what I understand, to the degree that there is purpose behind people or behind this movement, which you say, well, that's conspiracy theory. Well, no, not necessarily. There are entities, large foundations, for example, that throw lots of money at this stuff. Those people have a reason. Nobody gives out over the course of the last decade or something like $1 trillion toward this garbage unless they have a reason to have done so, right? So somebody has a reason for fueling this monster. By the way, Mark, that's another answer to why did this come out when it did. People started putting money into it. Let's just get to a very simple answer there. I'll just give you a quick example, then I'll get back to the question. A lot of us remember the Human Rights Campaign, the yellow equal sign instead of blue field or whatever. Kind of a gay rights organization is what it's always been, and it used to do such good work, and everybody has this like very positive memory. Still see stickers on people's cars here and there. It used to be on like everybody's car, like even here in East Tennessee, like so many. I'd see the sticker every time I'd go out. The Human Rights Campaign. Well, in 2008, one of these big NGO foundations dumped a $10 million grant into the HRC. And the next thing you know, the HRC is like literally putting out propaganda about front holes and lady dicks. Like it completely went off the rails. But why? Because they were given a $10 million grant. And if you want that money again after you invested all in infrastructure and hires and all of this, well, it looks like, why don't we make a few changes? So you can look up for yourself which organization gave them $10 million in 2008, and you can find out. You're not allowed to say which organization it was. It's a big one. And so this happened though, and this kind of thing started happening around then. The late 2000s is when a lot of money started getting dumped from big foundations into these various different things. The same foundation, as a matter of fact, in 2016 or 17 created the African American Policy Forum, which is run by Kimberly Crenshaw to push tons of intersectionality out into the world. And it's massively funded, huge grants, exact same weird organization. Why is this organization dumping millions upon millions upon millions of dollars, many billions of dollars now over the last decade or so, into this if there's not some kind of purpose thing behind it? And so the question is, is it too late to reverse that trend? That's what Douglas is bringing up. Now, I grapple with this because I don't know. Because if you've ever read Thomas Sowell took all this crap apart 20, 25, 30 years ago, took it apart root and branch. I mean, pulled up every possible root of the thing 30 years ago. And I'll just notice, given the identity politics relevance to the way that they argue, Thomas Sowell is black. And so we had a black guy, extremely intelligent, extremely articulate, extremely accurate, extremely well-read, extremely thorough, take all this stuff apart 30 years ago, among other people. There were many other people who were doing excellent work on this 30 years ago. And it did nothing to slow it down. Nobody paid attention because it didn't mean a thing to them until it was affecting their lives. And so I wrestle. I don't know if we release Cynical Theories, which came out late, by the way, because of the pandemic. It was supposed to come out May 5th, and it came out August 25th or 8th or something like that. So it came out late because of the pandemic. I don't know if we came out too late or at exactly the right time, plus or minus a few months. Maybe May 5th would have been better than August 28th. I don't know. But until, I was afraid, actually, just to tell you, Cynical Theories, the draft was due to the publisher by August 31, 2019. So you can see this is before the pandemic was anywhere on the horizon. This is before anything like, the BLM riots of last summer. This is long before any of this hit mainstream. This was long before Donald Trump issues his executive order and brought the word critical race theory onto the international stage in a new way. This is long before any of that. And we finished that book, and when Helen and I were writing it, I was like, let's take some swings for the fences here and there, So I was actually nervous when we delivered the book to the publisher. I was nervous on May 5th when it was supposed to come out that we said too much, that we went too far, that we wouldn't be believable. And then George Floyd died, and the world went bonkers. And then the book comes out, and I read it right after it. I read it right before it came out, actually. I read it in full when I flew out to go on Rogan's show, which was July 1st last year. And I read it on the whole thing on an airplane ride to LA. What a fun ride that was. My brain hurt by the time I read my own book. I'm like, what is this thing? And so I was like, wow, we're really measured. We sound so careful and responsible. But had the world not blown up 2 months before, or a month before, I guess at that point, had the world not blown up a month before, I don't know how it would have been received. We maybe would have been considered as histrionic. It may have mostly been ignored, and as opposed to a book of answers for what was going on. And so it's entirely possible that, give or take a couple of months, that we actually landed at exactly the right time, because these arguments have been being made. I don't know what to do with the fact that I think up my own arguments as far as I know, but the fight against this has been being waged for decades extremely well to zero effect. And it wasn't because the arguments weren't being made well, and it wasn't because they weren't being made by the right people. Thomas Sowell is wonderful and brilliant, and he's black, which matters under the new economy of ideas. Had no impact. And it's because it wasn't real to people. And until this became real to people, there's absolutely nothing that you could say to convince them that something this crazy is actually going on, and that this crazy is erupting out of the university, and that it's going to stick, that it's actually going to happen in the world. So I don't know, but this is the question I grapple with. We're talking I'm not a believer religiously myself, but I keep thinking of we're talking this is a nudge, almost supernatural nudge of timing, as far as I can tell. Not because of what I did is so great, but just that it landed at exactly the right month, give or take one, given what's going on, as far as I can tell, because nobody would listen before that.
Can I say point out that Ray Kurzweil has this thing where he talks about people think in linear ways, but things happen in kind of geometric ways. And one of the examples he uses is like in the 90s, we heard the internet's coming, the internet's coming, the internet, everybody's going to have a computer, it's going to be out there. And we were all hyped up, and then like nothing happened. And you're like, oh, there's like one website. And then it was all just hype. Then next thing you knew, it was everywhere, right? It was everywhere. Everywhere there was a website. Everybody was online. And he points out there's this nature where we think linearly and we think it's things are moving on a straight line. But really the power of doubling, right, is all in that last few doubles where it goes vertical, right? And so the number of servers are doubling and doubling and doubling and doubling, right? So I'm just pointing out that works for and against. It's a sword that cuts both ways. So here you had these ideas, these postmodernist ideas that was one person, then two, then four, then 8, then 16, right? And we heard about it. But it was like these fringe things, and we figured out, I haven't heard about it, therefore it can't be that big a deal. And the next thing you know, at the very end of that curve, it goes vertical because at the very end you're doubling to 1 million, then to 2 million, then to 4 million, then to 8 million, and it's everywhere all of a sudden. And now we're fighting against it, right? And you're on podcasts and writing books, and so are we doing our small part. And you're converting one person and 2 people and 3 people, and we're not seeing that big impact, right, that you hope is there. But what we got to understand, hopefully, is that we're also on that geometric, right, progression, and that as this becomes a groundswell and it doubles and doubles and doubles, you have this big wave coming back the other way. So
no, I believe that actually, and I think the data that because I, for good or for ill, end up on the very front edge of kind of what's going on in the world, and so I make these guesses on Twitter based on my gut feelings and my intuitions based on what I'm hearing, and I've been saying for the last little while something has changed. I even said not that long ago the end of critical race theory I think it's coming. I think critical race theory broke itself. I've talked to a number of people who are running for political office in various states now, and all Republican. The Democrats aren't that interested in me for some reason. And I've talked to them, and they say that they get up on stage because if they've contacted me, obviously they've probably interacted with some of my work, so they end up somebody from their office will contact them, and they say to an audience, and we're talking to an audience of like grandmothers, normal everyday folks, are like, and we're going to get critical race theory out of the schools, and like the audience catches on fire. So
that's great to hear.
Yeah, so there is this situation that has happened where there's a lot more awareness of it than one would expect, and that has actually that idea that the resistance has doubled and doubled and doubled, that it's a geometric thing, is very plausible, that people are realizing that this is a fight they have to engage in. And then I talked with, I don't know if you know who Michael Malice is, but I spoke with Michael Malice about a week ago. He's a very interesting character. I like him a lot. And he reminded me of a point that I knew, and pointed out something that I hadn't thought about with regard to that point, which is that, in these kinds of social movements, it actually takes a relatively small proportion of this of a population to overturn an institution or a country or something. 3.5% is often cited. And then there's going to be a halo, like a cloud of kind of water carriers around that. And so he said, well, your target then is if they have 3 or 4% of the population and they might be able to bend our civilization their way, you don't have to get to 51% of the population to win the fight. You have to get to 3 or 4%. That's like, if they have 3.5, you need 3.6. And that is a much easier target to hit than convincing 50% of the population or 55% of the population to care about this.
Well,
I have a suggestion.
I just also wanted to say, I think, look, these ideas metastasized in a university environment where they had no competition, right? And now it's out in the marketplace of competition. It's trying to knock out the competition, but it can't. So I think taking the point from the virologist in World War Z, the virus's strength is also its weakness. Its strength is its capacity to undo and disintegrate things, but that's also its weakness. And now that it's confronting solid ideas, solid rationality, it's going to bust itself apart in my point of view.
And more importantly, in the political science sense, it's confronting upper middle class parents who are all of a sudden realizing it's going to screw their children out of their future. And that's usually when bad social movements turn around, according to political scientists.
Yeah, James, I'm sure you're familiar with your co-author on the grievance study stuff, Peter Boghossian's earlier book, A Manual on How to Create Atheists, or I forget the exact title, something like that, where he he's battling against what he thinks is a bad set of ideas, and he creates a kind of whole training program for what he called street epistemologists, and gives them all kinds of tools on how they can, even on a line at a supermarket, if somebody says God bless you when you sneeze, that's an opportunity to try to convert somebody from their ideology into good epistemology. So I don't want to give you guys more homework, but it would be great if you and Peter maybe could write a manual for creating, some kind of non-woke, because the average person, I have relatives and whatnot who they don't follow any of this stuff, but they have some idea about it. It'd be nice to be able to give something. This book is wonderful. I'm an academic, so I just ate this book up alive. It was really great, the history and all the ideology, there's brilliant levels of analysis and all that. But there needs to be like a really short version for the average person. Oh, that one.
Yeah.
Okay, so James,
That's a
that was
great
my
one.
other question. Yeah, that's a great book. But so, and Mark Pellegrino, this was really his question from
that's
previously.
the embarrassing part.
But let me say this. I got to say this. Recently, I think Mark Pellegrino and Mark Gleason and we were on one of our podcasts, and it came up like, you wrote that great book, How to Have Impossible Conversations with Rappaport's Rules and Steelman. But then, you're wonderful on Twitter. We just love the way you don't play by those rules on Twitter. So it's like two different sets. We need to have you explain how the guy who wrote that book is, so entertaining on Twitter. Is
Making mother jokes.
Yeah, is it like you start out with a golden rule, which is like how to have impossible conversations, and when that fails, you switch to a silver rule, which is if somebody messes with you, you just cut them in half. Could you speak to that, please?
It's the cold steel rule is what it is. So yeah, I can't actually talk about that. Let me say the embarrassing part. So within How to Have Impossible Conversations at the beginning, we actually were confronting. The idea was, in fact, that we thought that the techniques in A Manual for Creating Atheists could be expanded and universalized. And that was really the heart of deciding to write that book. And then this woke thing was rapidly expanding. And we were attempting the techniques, and they work on, the most intense religious people you can imagine, and they just don't work on woke people. And it was like,
wow.
What in the world? And so we actually have this
Amazing.
whole digression at the beginning where we talk about to have an impossible conversation requires you to be able to have a conversation. It's not every single dialogue can be turned into a productive conversation, because if the other person's not willing to converse with you, if they haven't accepted the same rules of engagement of dialogue as you have, then you probably are not going to be able to get anywhere with them. And the woke ideology literally views conversation and dialogue as
Oppression.
power-infused tools that oppress viewpoints that disagree with them. They also exempt themselves from the rules of normal decorum. And so this brings me to Twitter. So I practice a martial art, and the core principle at the of my martial art.
Which one?
It's called Baguazhang. It's a Chinese art. It's based on the Taoist principles of the I Ching, which is their ancient, book of change.
Yeah.
And so, being that it's based in a book of change and based in Taoist principles, the core principles of martial art is go according to the situation. So, for example, just as a rudimentary thing, if you're fighting somebody who's punching and kicking, you probably are not going to, just try to grab onto them and grapple. Or if you're grappling with somebody, you're probably not going to punch and kick. Or if it's all mixed together, you shouldn't do something that's inappropriate for the situation that you're in. I could get a better one, but if somebody's got you in a headlock, you probably shouldn't try to punch them. It's probably not going to work. You got to go according to the situation that you're in. And in also that I practice the martial art, I do hold up pretty high on the list of archetypes for myself. I've always kind of looked up to, all the way back to being a kid, the scholar warrior, right? So this is an archetype.
The warrior
And so
poet.
what I see Twitter as is the arena. So you could picture yourself, the arena is a Roman thing. So you can picture yourself as a Roman arena gladiator, right? And how do you carry yourself in the city? You go around just chopping everybody down? No, of course not. But then when you end up in the arena, you act in a different way. Folks, I'm going to tell you, World War III is being fought on Twitter.com right now. Twitter.com is not a conversation. It is a battleground. And I have realized this. And so I behave according to a different set of rules. In fact, now you mentioned Rappaport's rules. So this works out really, really to my advantage in this little part of the conversation, because Anatoly Rappaport was a game theorist. He wasn't a conversational theorist. He was a game theorist. We had these rules for dialogue. which are great. It's basically to represent your opponent's argument so vividly that they would say, wow, I wish I thought of it that way, before you offer any criticism. You should state what you learned from them. You should be able to articulate their position back to them better than they can, to prove that you fully understand it before, and that you value it before you offer any criticism. So this is Rappaport's rules for dialogue. Well, Rappaport was a game theorist. In fact, Anatoly Rappaport is the one who's famous for coming up with the tit for tat solution to the iterated prisoner's dilemma.
That's right.
My rule on Twitter, aside from not taking, my first rule is don't take yourself too seriously. Just have some fun. Say some crazy stuff. Why not? It's just Twitter. It's like a river of words. It goes away. But the second thing is, and also it's like a video game. Like, I don't see the thing on Twitter as myself. It's my Twitter. And I'm sorry if that doesn't work for you when I say something about your mother, but your mom didn't mind. That's all I can say to that. Your mom liked it. In fact, she asked for more. Your mom asks for more every time. She doesn't ever stop.
James, when I was a kid growing up in the projects, your mother jokes and rank out contests were our biggest activity. It was so much fun.
Yeah, totally. But no, then my rule though is largely tit for tat. It is largely tit for tat. If you come to me with something reasonable, occasionally I screw up. If you're, somebody who's trying to trash on me, occasionally I screw up and play some friendly fire. Occasionally I overreact and misread something. It happens. I'm not perfect. I'm a person too. And, I'll apologize privately for that. If asked, I probably won't apologize publicly or on demand for things, given the nature of the circumstances we find ourselves in right now, which those are not good things to do in the arena. Don't set your shield down in the middle of the arena. It's not a good plan.
Exactly.
But that said, if you come thoughtfully to me, I will probably interact thoughtfully with you if I have time and see it. If you come with your smart ass to me, I'm going to outsmart ass you. I'm going to tit for tat you. And that's generally the rule. And people are like, well, why do you go after these certain characters? And they don't know the backstory. This is actually an important structural thing about Twitter that we should have a whole dialogue about, is that on Twitter, everything's out of context constantly. If you think of the rule within like filmmaking or storytelling, that the context has to be completely completely encapsulated context. Somebody comes to a story, they shouldn't have to be able to refer to something outside the story to make sense of it. If somebody comes to a video, an explanatory video, I shouldn't be like, when we were talking last week, and everybody who's watching has no idea what we're talking about now. It needs to be self-contained. Well, Twitter violates that rule on every tweet. Nobody ever knows the full context of anything that's happening. And so people are like, oh, you go after these people. Why do you do that? And I won't name them here, but they knew who they are, and I know who they are. Believe you me, they've come after me a lot of times that I've forgiven or ignored before. If I've taken a shot at somebody, they have earned that shot, and I have crept through the woods like a sniper and lined that shot up for a while before I took it. And it's not like I thought about what will I do or planned it. I saw my opportunity. I have a friend who actually is a sniper, and he told me about some of these scary freaking missions where he crawled through the woods, and I'm picturing this in my mind, and he has his gun trained on this. Literally, this happened. He has this gun trained on this like facility. This is a real story of a real guy who's doing a real USMC mission that really did this. He's got his gun trained. He lays there for like 9 hours without moving or eating or going to the bathroom or whatever it is that you're not allowed to do, with his gun pointed at this like little bunker thing. Finally, some guy comes out to smoke, so he shoots the guy in the crotch, because apparently it disables you and you're hurt, but you don't die for a while. And so then one after another, after the guys come out to come grab him, he shoots those people and kills them, and then he kills the guy that he shot the first time. This is real. And so like that's strategies of war, right? So, but you can't just get up there with your gun and then shoot, right? You have to you see your shot and you take it. And so that's what I do with these people. If people who sit there and trash talk me and trash talk me and trash talk me and trash talk me and trash talk me, eventually that's tit. The tat is coming. Because I'm not going to lay down and just be a doormat in front of this crap, especially on a place like Twitter, where like literally, why do you take Twitter seriously? Why does anybody take Twitter seriously?
Well, I only take it seriously because it can have some impact on my life and career.
No, yeah, of course.
But I am
understand
I
that
am the
aspect.
same way as you. I will take the tit 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 and then deliver a few tat tat tats of my own.
A rat
And-
tat
One of
tat.
the
And
one of the
so-
reasons I thought I could read your book and say, maybe I can apply a whole different way of argumentation on Twitter. And to a degree I do, but there's just people who aren't open to it. And like in the street, you know, if you confront those people confront you, you really have no choice.
Right.
to get
With the
them
woke, somebody told me this recently, and it was profound for me. And I wish I could remember who said it. It's one of these kind of Sam Harris flavored things, but it wasn't Sam Harris because he doesn't talk to me. He stopped following me on Twitter. I mean, it's a thing. But they said, you know, it's a very much in line. You know, Sam Harris had these very famous remarks back in the day. If somebody doesn't value reason, what reason could you give them to value reason? If somebody doesn't value evidence, what evidence could you show them to get them to value evidence? And there's another one in there. Is somebody said recently to me, you don't always assume you can appeal to somebody's better nature because maybe they don't have one. Right. And so with the woke, because they have a very means justify the ends mentality that arises out of thinking entirely in terms of power dynamics that they believe are wholly unjust. And I mean, that's got a long academic pedigree. I could quote Marcuse on it out of Essay on Liberation right now if I would opened it up and found the passage. About the ends justifying the means. He has a long couple of paragraphs about it. You can't appeal to somebody's better nature in general if, kind of following C.S. Lewis here, if what they think they're doing is more moral than you. If they think that they have the better nature, you can't appeal to a better nature than that. And so there's nothing to appeal to there. And you can't appeal to reason if they think that reason is a tool of the oppressor. You can't appeal to evidence if they think that the evidence is just a way to shuttle away alternative viewpoints. And that's where we talked about with the idea that you can't have a conversation with somebody who doesn't agree upon the basic principles and rules of engagement. That's kind of what's going on. So with woke, at some point, there's all you can kind of do is operate on the same ground that they're operating on, which is to kind of subvert or make fun of or mock or kind of embarrass or whatever. But if you're thinking, oh, well, I'll just come in a reasonable fashion and appeal to their better nature, A, they might not have one, or B, they might think that because they're on the right side of history and you're an awful person, that you have no moral standing to be able to do that. And so it's not a winning tactic at that point when you're dealing with somebody who's convicted of those things.
And this is an important point, right? And so I tried to explain this to somebody the other day. If wokeist is a religion, right, it's not like a Quaker, and it's not like a Buddhist. It's
Or
not,
a Jain.
Or even like a Sunni Muslim or a Catholic, right? Because to me, it's more like Scientology, where we are fighting a war for salvation the way we've defined it. Anything we say and do is completely justified, right? Even to each other. If I lie to you in Scientology to make you a better person, that's okay because I'm following Scientology. And so it's like propaganda is the religion. Anything you do and say to win this war is justified. And anybody who's one of our group who we shun, we all must shun. You must cut them all off, or else you yourself are guilty of helping the enemy, right? And so it is this all-out. It's like this Machiavellian ends justify the means, written into canon, right? I mean, and so.
Yeah.
So it's so when I compare it to religion, I just say, you know, for the listeners, it's like Scientology, right? It's
I even said that once.
yeah.
Yeah, in 2019, I was having a conversation with somebody, and they were telling me something about critical race theory. I was still a little bit new to learning a lot of the details about it. And I was like, this is black Scientology. That's what I actually said about critical race theory. What I was particularly thinking about, though, is the idea that there's this system of racism, and like it kind of latches onto people, right? Like whiteness latches onto people like it's your thetans or whatever.
Yes, exactly.
And so you have to do the work. You have to go through these processes and ongoing
To cleanse
process of
yourself.
self-reflection, self-critique, and social activism to remove your thetans. And that's exactly the same as like hooking yourself up to an e-meter and getting audited. You have to do like racism audits.
It's
with
a struggle
yourself, or
session.
whiteness audits.
A struggle session is the equivalent of these e-meter sessions, right? And by
Yeah,
the
that's
way,
exactly
your
right.
opinion's not valid. You know why? Because the thetans in control of you, or your supremacy is so
That's
embedded
right.
in you that you don't even see it. Therefore, I can disregard everything you're saying.
And a key phrase around that is interrogate your defensiveness. Like they present you with
Yeah.
the hypothesis
check
that
your
you're
privilege,
racist or
too.
anti-black or somehow complicit in whiteness or white supremacy, and then they tell you, oh, did that make you feel uncomfortable? You have to interrogate your defensiveness. And like, I knew a Scientologist, and I'm like, this is what they did.
Well, they did it as a moral value. I mean, no big world religion is above a little bit of propaganda. Let's be honest, right? But they do it as the moral value. It is the moral virtue to lie, deceive, to twist reality, to intimidate, to sue, to spam, to stalk, whatever you need to do to help the faith. You do.
Yeah, because the one thing
'Cause it's-
that has objective value and objective reality is what they want to deconstruct and eliminate.
Well, and it's the power,
Ironically.
and the power to convince, right? All that matters is the power to convince. And you ask why all this money got dumped into this ideology, is because there's a lot of money and power, and the people who want power saw this and said, "Hey, this is pretty useful. If we dump 10, 50, $100 million in this, we can cause. Look, there's a lot of money in being able to cause riots in any city you want, whenever you want." Right? There's a lot of money in having DAs that will release rioters without charging them in a revolving door, so you can keep people, rioting and intimidated. Right? So there's many, many reasons why people in power want more power, and the way they get it is the power to convince. So. To me, it's not a mystery why a bunch of money started dumping into this, and why we started seeing the emergence. To me, it was always so obvious the benefits we have of living in a civilized society, and a civil society. America somehow escaped from the cyclical blood feuds that just have dominated other places in the world, right? Ireland, for instance, let's say, right? I mean, just you get a peace, but you know what? You killed my brother, so I'm still going to go out and kill one of you, even though there's a peace, right? And this blood feud just continues and continues and continues, and America had largely escaped that. And all these people trying to push us back into anarchy, thinking, "Oh, we'll change a few things and it will all be right with the world." They don't understand violence. And honestly, I think I wanted to get your comment on this as a martial artist. I have two questions for you, and I came in really wanting to know this. I also study martial arts, as does Rick, as does Mark P. All of us experienced some level of violence or bullying when we were young, right? And so all of us responded to that with being able, I think, to prepare ourselves, protect ourselves, and then apply that and protect others. So in your martial arts training, did that come? How did you arrive at that? And do you think that martial spirit and martial nature kind of forced you to be gravitated toward these kinds of fights? Was it because that you were the only one who felt like you could do it, or because you were the right man in the right time, or so did you experience bullying, I guess, when you were young, is my first question. And the second is, how has your martial spirit prepared you for this fight?
So when I was a kid, not really. I probably was kind of the bully when I was like a young kid.
Mark Pellegrino might have been occasionally both bully and bullied.
Yeah, I was.
Yeah. And so I did get beat up a couple times because I tried to like pick fights with kids who were a lot older than I was. But when I was a teenager, though, I got really dorky, right? I really got dorky, and I was on like the math club and all this stuff in high school. And there were actually some people who bullied me, but I usually was able to like talk my way into like some kind of a gross symbiotic corrupt relationship or whatever.
You did their math homework for them? You did their math homework for them?
Spanish, usually. Yeah, my Spanish was actually really good in high school. And so I ended up taking a class, though, with a guy. I'd always kind of been interested after having watched The Karate Kid and every other thing in karate. And I ended up taking a class with a guy who was a black belt, and he talked me into going to the school where he trained, and I went over there, and I actually really liked it. Like, I kind of had always wanted to do it, and I really liked it. And I actually got pretty good at it. I sport fought for a number of years, and I did jujitsu back in the 90s, like way back in the 90s, like
Gracie Jiu-Jitsu? Or?
My teacher at the time was actually flying out to LA to train with Hickson in his garage when it was that time period. And
I was training then too, by the way.
What's that?
Yeah, I was Craig Kukuk, right here in Red Bank, or down the street, was one of the first American black belts in Gracie Jiu-Jitsu.
Yeah, I think I was working out with one of the first black belts in the Southeast in Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. And I didn't much love Jiu-Jitsu, to be honest with you, so I kind of bailed out on it. But I don't know if that's what led me to want to take up this fight. I tell people I fell ass backwards into this fight. But I do feel like, in a way, whether you want to use Jiu-Jitsu, because Jiu, of course, means soft, right? And it means kind of pliant. You are pliant to the forces of the opponent and try to gain advantageous position or wear the opponent down, and then, you know, apply a technique that, you know, incapacitates them, whether it's a choke or whether it's a joint lock or something like that. The art that I practiced, Baguazhang, was actually developed in China to answer another art that nobody's ever heard of called Xingyichuan. Xingyichuan was developed in, I think, like 1100-ish or 1140 or something like that by one of their war generals. It's based on the 5-element theory of Chinese thought, and it's just like famously brutal forward linear force. And so it's like Xingyichuan is the Chinese martial arts equivalent of the Blitzkrieg. And so Baguazhang, which is what I studied, was actually developed in the 1840s, largely to be able to take on Xingyichuan and to defeat Xingyichuan using round motion and changing forces rather than this overwhelming straight line force. So with Xingyi, one of your primary goals, if you can't just blitz the guy and hit him, is to actually put him on his heels. And I see this actually, it turns out that it worked out pretty well as far as the mentality goes, because the woke ideology works to put people on it comes in with very direct straight line force, as much as it talks about being subversive, and there is a subversive element to it, but it comes in with its usual tactic. It's come with blinding straight line force to make the person that they're talking to either feel stupid or immoral. And so they kind of like have two elements, you know, stupid and immoral. And if you know how to kind of flank that, they have absolutely no defense left, right? And so the art that I train is actually heavily invested in the idea of flanking and then hitting really damn hard. And so
makes a
and
lot
hitting
of
people
sense.
hard at an angle where they have no ability to do anything about it. So maybe that has, you know, laid some of the mental wiring for, you know, I mean, so there's another principle in our art, which is never put force on force. If somebody applies force to you, never apply force directly back against that force. At best, it's a stalemate, and at worst, it's a waste.
Right.
Or, you know, it's just going to work out badly. And so instead, you're supposed to redirect force or flank force or whatever.
That's the yielding principle in Taoism.
Yeah, right.
Yielding.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the idea, right? Is that this is the Bagua, has all 8 of the so-called trigrams of the I Ching, and so you go according to the situation. When it's time to be pliant, you're pliant. When it's time to be strong, you're strong. So that's sort of the. I mean, I think jiu-jitsu has a lot actually in common with that. You know, it would have, for another principle we have is like. Avoid the heavy blows and let the light blows fall if it gives you the ability to gain the advantage or whatever. So I've seen enough UFC fights to watch the guys take glancing blows so that they can worm their way into either a throw or a grab or a hold or whatever. So I don't know. I say I fell ass backwards into this fight. I say it all the time. I allude to Seinfeld, where Jerry's describing Kramer's life and says he falls ass backwards into money. And it's like, that's how I feel like with this thing. It was like I was just trying to do my own damn thing. And the next thing you know, it's like culture wars happening near me. And then I can't leave it alone. And the next thing you know, I'm literally like the international world expert in the damn subject. And now I have to talk about it all the time. And there's this definite feeling of having just kind of, I didn't go looking for the fight, like, if you will, but it wasn't like I got canceled and all of a sudden I have to fight my way back out of this hole. It's, you know, I just happened to be there and I noticed the fight was happening. It's honestly, it's not totally unlike a couple of years ago. I was in Manhattan, and literally I'm walking back from dinner with a group of people. It's like pretty late, probably 10:30 at night or something. There's literally a rape happening like right there on the street, like 57th, right by Park Avenue, like nice part of Midtown. So we're walking, and this is happening. It's this big dude, you know, in the passenger seat of a car. The door's open. He's standing on the street. Her legs are sticking out. She's screaming. And me and this other guy, like, we're walking by this, and the vibe, I don't want to sound like a courageous guy or whatever, because the vibe was like, I don't want to deal with this. Why is this here? Why? I don't want to deal with this. But then I'm looking at it, you know, me and this other guy in the group are looking at it, and we got to do something. So we just kind of, as one mind, turned and started walking toward the guy and calling out to the girl, and we ended up scaring the guy off. No physical altercation occurred. Broke the thing up. But it's kind of like that, right? It's like this thing. I was walking down the street minding my own business, in metaphor. I'm walking down minding my own damn business, and this stupid thing is happening, and I see it, and I can't leave it alone. I have to do something about it. It's sort of like that's how I got into this.
I think that's how most of us got into it. Yeah, but we're
Yep.
so happy that you happened upon that thing that you had to stop because you're doing a great job,
Well,
James.
that's part of the power of the 3%, right? They care about it completely. We care about it not at all. And that's why it goes unchecked for so long. Because why should I be out there fighting against alien conspiracy theories? It doesn't affect me. Until one day they're in charge of the government and affecting my life, and now I have to go fight against it. So,
Yeah, exactly.
So now we do care. Well, look, James, you've been very generous with your time, and Mark Pellegrino as well. We're coming up on 2 hours. We would be happy to continue the conversation, but we want to make sure that we're okay on time. How are you doing there, James, on time?
I can give a little bit more. I think I can handle it.
Okay, well, we can always go to a few.
What about you, Mark?
I'm good. I'm going
have
to
a
take a
little-
quick bathroom break, and I'll be right back.
Okay, well, we do have a question from our chat from our audience, and by the way, James, there was a lot of interest. We put out the call for people who wanted to attend and give us some live questions. There was a lot of interest in having you guys in more of a town hall setting where we had many people we had to turn away because we didn't want all of them on the Zoom call. So maybe in the future we could do that if you'd be amenable. But we have a good question here, and this is from one of our good friends and listeners, Kamiko, and that question is. Why does BLM eat their own that defend them? Like, for instance, they vandalized a CNN center that was on their side in Atlanta. So, right, so you do see, like, and I think maybe this goes back to the fact that it's not a coordinated strategy, because if it was a coordinated strategy, the entire movement, it would be much smarter about what it does. It would pick its fights, right? But instead, what it does is, they have these defenders that are kind of on their side, and the moment they go a little miss, like grabbing the microphone from Bernie Sanders, for instance. And Bernie Sanders is sitting there stunned going, I'm on your side. Why are you at my rally? Go down and go to Trump's rally and hassle him, right? So, but why is that? Is it because there's a purism, right? To that the corruption of the true faith cannot be allowed to stand, and therefore we're going to fight, the people nearby us and make sure we're all on the same page. Versus, and we'll get to that other fight later. So why does the wokists go after their own? Is the question.
I mean, that's kind of a big part of it is the purism. It's like if they go after CNN like that, and they already know that CNN is on side, and more importantly than the fact that they're on side, they are extortable. Then when they do that, they push CNN further into, like, you weren't on side enough. Now you weren't a total propaganda machine for us, so we're going to punish you. And it's a risk that they're taking. But if they can more or less guarantee that what's going to happen is that they're going to end up getting that knee bent, it's actually a tool to get people to double down in their commitment and double down into their support. The other thing is that in a very real way, I mean, this is the kind of thing that terrorist activity often includes, right? If it doesn't make sense, the image that it sends off, and you have to understand the psychological impact of this, is that these people are so convinced or so lunatic or so dangerous or whatever that they'll even blow up their friends, right? First of all, that projects a lot of strength. They don't need friends. They can just blow up their friends. Second of all, so they're not desperate for people to be on their side. They can hassle it. Secondly, it sends this message just out there entirely, like, screw you, screw everybody. We have a lot of power and we're not afraid to use it. And if you're not on our side, you think that you can get away with, some symbolic gesture and you're good. Think twice. That's a huge message. That's where you see, they'll take people put up the Black Lives Matter sign in their business and they'll break the window. And it's like not good enough, This is the kind of thing that, I mean, people have to understand that this is a very dedicated movement toward pushing in a very extreme view. The second thing, of course, is third thing, I guess, is one other aspect, is that all of these kinds of very radical vanguards exist in order to move an Overton window, to try to expand the limits of what people will find acceptable. And while they may never find vandalizing the CNN acceptable, they may never find that actually to be acceptable. What they will say is, well, something further than you've already gone, but short of that is acceptable. So now they've moved the range of acceptability by doing something that went way too far, where people are like, wait, just don't go quite that far, and you can go further than you were. It's another aspect of this kind of very radical vanguard activism. that really has to be taken into account. You have to think that these people are playing for keeps, and their goal is actually total control of pretty much everything. This isn't a friendly neighborhood, reasonable project that we're watching happen here.
Yeah, and there is this idea that I alluded to earlier, which is that inter-sibling violence. Catholics and Protestants they fight much more bitterly because there's very little chance if I'm a Catholic that my Catholic flock will be led astray by the Muslim guy down the street, right? I mean, we'll fight him later. Don't get me wrong, but he's not going to take one of my the true faith. He's too radical. He's too outside our Overton window. But those Protestants down the street, well, they're a corruption of the true faith, and they can lead my true flock astray. And that's why they need to be soundly routed. We need to crush them because otherwise my flock will be led astray, right? And you see that not just with those two, but with religious violence worldwide. It's always particularly brutal when there's a chance that people might be led astray. So I'm wondering if that's because sometimes you see this like accidental violence, not violence, but accidental attacks that happen with the wokus. But then sometimes, particularly the more reasonable ones come out, and they get pounced on like a narc at a biker rally, with a gusto. And is it like that? Is it basically showing, they're competing for the same audience, essentially, and you got the more reasonable voice, and you got the other people, and they're worried. Hey, this person's watering down the message. We're finally getting traction on this revolution. And all these people who are saying, you should take yoga. I saw an attack on yoga, right? Yoga just helps you better deal with your oppression and less likely to revolt. And therefore, yoga must be put down. And so when you start attacking yoga, you're like, what are these people going after? But it's as simple as that, right? They don't want any watering down of their momentum and their message, and they will take out any competitor to their power, including the one standing next to them.
Oh, sure. I mean, taking the competitor power thing is going to be a huge element of this. There's also to be appreciated that BLM as an organization is rooted in neo-Marxism, and CNN is a corporate entity. So they're already not friends. It's basically how willing is CNN to do the bidding? That's the question for them. How long are they willing to stay useful? Again, this is not a friendly neighborhood, reasonable thing that's happening here. This is an extortion racket. You see Target, for example, which they looted and burned, however many of those. Target is now donating millions and millions of dollars to their stupid organization, and you find out who, like, if you go, this is another aspect to it. Then it's like testing, right? If you go whack CNN and CNN comes more on side, now you know who your marks are as an extortion racket, or as a racketeer in this case. You really do have to kind of enter. We've talked about Scientology, we've talked about communists, but you really do have to enter into the idea that there's almost like a mafia-like logic behind what's going on here, and they're going around whacking people in the neighborhood to make sure that everybody else knows that the whole neighborhood's subject to get whacked.
Protection services protect you from us.
Yeah, exactly.
Literally a brick through the window, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, if we endorse you, you won't get a brick through your window, right?
Yeah, this is not a friendly neighborhood project. These are not reasonable people acting in reasonable ways that are comprehensible on reasonable terms.
One last thing, maybe not the last thing. Oh, you let us know when you want to split. 2 + 2 is 4. James?
Yeah, last I checked.
Well, no, but again, this is the assault on truth, right? If you can, there's a great Star Trek episode, right, where he's being interrogated, and there's 4 lights or whatever it is, and they're saying that there's supposed to be 3, and he keeps on saying there's 4 lights, right? Because he won't. Yeah. Because once you start admitting an untruth, even though it's not true, that they can begin to bend your once you agree to untrue things. Well, 2 + 2 is not really 4; it's really 5. Once you can get people putting that in their bios, for goodness sake, right? It's a separation of truth, right? So, and again, this goes back to this power to convince, right? Could you explain the desert of the real?
Sure.
You mentioned that before, which was this idea that we're being fed things that are real as if they're images though. They aren't really real, right?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, the 2 + 2 = 4 thing, I think a lot of people have already heard the story, so I won't relate the whole story. But that was, I think, the most masterful piece of trolling I've ever done in my entire life. I'm still really proud of that. I started that whole thing, as far as it goes.
Good for you.
And now you've got the Th Chan School of Public Health repeatedly defending 2 + 2 = 5 in the middle of a pandemic when people think that they might be overcounting case numbers and death numbers. Freaking amazing. But with the whole Orwell thing, so then they had to go on this whole line of thought of trying to discredit Orwell and say Orwell meant something else, and now Orwell is white privilege or something. It's just fabulous. But the desert of the real. So this is a concept central to the thoughts of Jean Baudrillard. Jean Baudrillard, you should probably realize, The Matrix as a film, the film was based off of Baudrillard's philosophy. Baudrillard said they got it wrong, but I don't know if that's true or not. I think it fits pretty well. And then if you even need to, like, a little nugget in there, if you look at the beginning of The Matrix, go back and watch it, the first one, you got Neo before Morpheus meets up with him, and he's got his contraband software in a drawer hidden inside of a fake book. And the book is Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation. And so in Baudrillard's philosophy, what he actually lays out here, and so you can get the idea already of desert or the real from The Matrix, by the way. What he lays out is this analogy of a map. Imagine a map that's so big and so perfect that it actually is a one-to-one correspondence with actual reality exactly as it is. And so what's happening then afterwards, the cartographers, having perfectly mapped reality and kept up with it, they start changing the map. But you can start to change the map, and it's an exact representation of reality up to that point where you start to change the map. And all of a sudden, you're not even bothering with what's going on in reality anymore. All you now care about is drawing your new map and changing things on the map and moving buildings around on the map and putting a tree in a different place on the map. And what he's saying is that's the kind of world that we actually live in, where we become more obsessed with the map than the actual terrain, or more interested in the map than the terrain. And we've lost sight, as a matter of fact, of the terrain at all. And so it's as though we're walking around in this desert where real things no longer exist. And so we're in a desert of the real. The real would be like water, and you're looking for in the desert. And we're in this huge desert of the real. And where he's coming from with this is this idea of simulation, simulacrum. He says we're essentially living in a simulation that's filled with these things that are simulacra of real things. For Baudrillard, though, it's all really weird, because his definition of the real is that which can be copied, which is a bizarre. It's the original that which can be original thing that can be copied. And so, I actually did a podcast recently with a friend of mine who did a really great job talking about how you can think of the progression from wild strawberries to cultivated strawberries to strawberry candy to artificially flavored strawberry candy to, soda flavored like an artificially flavored strawberry candy. And you have this whole list of simulacra of this original thing, the wild strawberry. And he finally brought it home by saying, and so I'm with my kid, and he's only ever drank the soda, and he finds a wild strawberry on the ground, and he says, it looks like the picture on the bottle, and he picks it up and he tastes it, and he says, this tastes like a bad version of the soda. And so that's the idea of the desert of the real, is that we live in a world where everything is images of images of images of images, where the actual real authentic thing is so far removed that when we encounter it, we think it's the fake thing. That we are so divorced, so unable to find reality any longer through this relentless procession of images and relentless procession of narratives and things being spun about reality, political spin, for example, that we don't have any access to the real at all. And that real things, in fact, for Baudrillard didn't even happen. He said that the Gulf War didn't happen, for example. It was a CNN spectacle. Real things happened in the Gulf, but the war was a television spectacle. There was no real Gulf War. This is a very famous essay that he wrote. He said after 9/11, he was still alive. He said after 9/11 that 9/11 was the first, in a sense, a blessing, because it was the first incursion of reality in over a decade.
He's not wrong, and that makes it easy for grifters to jump in and take control, right? Because we're divorced from reality, and now it's just all about narrative.
So he was arguing that it's from the fall of the Berlin Wall until 9/11, so 1989 to 2001, nothing real happened. And that's the idea of a desert of a real. It was all images. It's all copies of copies of copies of copies, where the original isn't even accessible any longer. That was his kind of philosophy about things. So even though real things were happening in the real world, nobody knows anything about them because all we know about is the map that's being drawn by the cartographers on, say, CNN.
That's right. You don't know what really happened.
But they're also getting their marching orders from the AP, and so it is a copy of a copy in a sense.
Yeah. And you get that sense now whenever, every now and then one will go viral on Twitter where you see the example of like 10,000 news organizations saying the same exact story word for word in some very awkward way, where it's just whatever came off the wire. The lazy ass journalist didn't do any work. They just read the thing on the wire and got it over with and tried to pass it off like they were doing original reporting instead of just reading something that was mass produced.
Grievance studies hoax kind of reminds me of that a little bit. It looks like it's the right kind of source, and it sounds right, so let's just publish it.
No, that's right. We actually, that was sort of in an essence, that was sort of what we were doing. It was people criticize this. We can't criticize postmodernism with a postmodern project. I'm like, I don't know why not, but it was, in a sense, we did create simulacra of their literature and then showed that they couldn't tell the difference. Now, we also characterized it as though we were doing a reflexive ethnography. So we were taking elements of this academic culture and then we were feeding it into their cultural system, then using the outputs to refine our understanding of that system. That's kind of how we think of what we did. But there's a very real point to where we were, doing a parodic form. So we had the politics of parody that Judith Butler talks about, the postmodern parodic form. We were doing a very Butlerian deconstruction of the field. Not exactly a Derridian deconstruction, but a very Butlerian deconstruction of the field. And we were certainly doing so by producing, simulacra of the real article and then showing that these people couldn't tell the difference between a simulacrum and the real article. And in fact, then to go full Baudrillard, what we'd say is there is no grievance studies literature. It's all And I made that argument. I said, somebody said, they said, did you write this paper and sent me some crazy paper? And I actually said, and I made an argument, I think publicly about this, you should, because of what we showed, you should just assume I wrote every paper in the field because there's no difference.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember one of the YouTube videos I saw of you did a presentation in front of some audience, I forget where, but you gave like the abstracts from a bunch of these grievance studies papers and asked the audience to vote on which ones you wrote and which ones they wrote. And like there was no way of differentiating them whatsoever. They were the real ones that you didn't write were just as absurd as the ones that you wrote.
Or more.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, I actually only read real ones.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. Right. None of them were yours.
Yeah, that was at Arizona State. In 2017. So that was I was very early, like in my progression with all of this and already, tapping into this. Now I really want to go either write or do a podcast episode for myself about the idea that the grievance studies affair was, that there are no grievance studies papers and give a Baudrillardian analysis of why there are no grievance studies papers. That's
We'd
really
be
fun.
happy to have you do that here if you like.
Well, look,
it's hilarious.
We did get a lot of interest in having the both of you on, and we had so much we were worried about the performance, so we decided we might do a future town hall event with you guys, if you wouldn't mind. And I'm not sure if we even have a third person on the panel. We could think about who that person should be. But maybe we could field a bunch of questions in advance and have a live audience, do more of a live stream with live questions coming in, if you guys would be amenable to that.
Yeah.
Maybe Peter
cool.
Bogosian. I know Peter.
Maybe.
I can ask him myself. Yeah.
Yeah, he's got high energy. He's not like Jeb. He's high energy.
Very good. By the way, I told Rick and I did not coordinate. We have our level to power "Thou shall not commit logical fallacy" T-shirts, and I wore mine. I had no idea we were going to wear the same one. I'm like, Rick, we're wearing the same dress to the ball. But
we did not
I
do
thought
this
you
on
guys did it
purpose.
on purpose.
No.
Yeah, no. Well, we'll make sure that you guys get your level to power merchandise as well.
Oh yeah, that's right.
I feel at home seeing that because it reminds me very much of the Jack Daniels
That's
label.
exactly
and
the
I am
idea.
in Tennessee.
Exactly
let me just
the
point out this font is different for legal reasons. It is not the Lynchburg font. It is something nowhere close to it. When we had the shirts printed, they were like, "Okay, we can't use the font though. We got to use this font." I'm like, "Whatever you gotta do, guys."
Yeah.
Well, very good. Well, just to go around the table then, Mr. Pellegrino, you have we've taken up a lot of your time. We've already gone past our time, and we're hugely appreciative of both of you coming and talking to us. Mr. Pellegrino, do you have any profound thoughts you'd like to share to help us wrap up here?
That's a lot of pressure, man. No, I mean, look, I was a spectator to this. I was really looking forward to meeting James in person. I listen to his podcast all the time, and I read his tweets with enthusiasm. And I'm a huge supporter, and I read your books as well. And I'm glad you're out there. I'm grateful that you're out there, and I'm glad that I could introduce you to some folks. I see the names up there are folks that are part of the Guardian Project, and I'm super happy that they can see you, being a rational warrior out there, man. It's awesome, and I'm honored to have. I didn't share the stage. I just sat here and listened to you do your magic, and it was an honor for me. Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Very good, Mr. Petty. Would you like to weigh in, and then producer, we're going to have the other half kind of join as well, if we could get them online.
Yeah, my sentiment's the same as Mark Pellegrino's. I think it was he who even said this maybe in a tweet recently or in one of our podcasts that I don't know if I'm putting words in your mouth, Mark Pellegrino, but that James Lindsay is the point man in the war against woke. Did you say that?
I think
Mark?
he did, yeah.
Yeah, and I thought he was the most important intellectual out there.
Yes, that's right. And I second that, and I'm just really honored that you came. Really loved having you here. And your books, your work, everything is so inspiring. Your grievance studies hoax totally convinced me that my suspicion about all this ideology, like I hear it from my colleagues in the academy, dressed up like it's real scholarship. And I always suspected, I don't know, maybe it's all kind of like a house of cards, as Wittgenstein said, of all philosophy. They're all kind of cross-referencing each other, and they've got these credentials and everything else. But once I read those grievance studies papers, I was like, oh, thank God, there's somebody out there who knows. And you convinced me, and that helped me to stand up against this stuff. So thank you.
That's awesome, because courage begets courage. That's a big thing we all got to start saying and getting out there right now. Courage begets courage. I tweeted it the other day, last night, I think, that it's a two-sided coin, though, because cowardice also begets cowardice. Yeah, exactly. So every time somebody sees somebody stand up, they'll stand up. Somebody else will stand up. But every time somebody sees somebody cave, they'll probably be more likely to cave. I think there was a great example of this that just happened, I think, in a restaurant or something. I shared the video on Twitter today, so you won't be able to find it because I've shared 3,400 other things since then. But they pushed out the COVID, trespassing COVID police or whatever it was out of this restaurant. And at first it was just going the way you would expect it to go. People were just kind of, this whole thing. And then this guy in the restaurant speaks up. He's like, you guys need to go. You're trespassing. The sign on the door. You got to go. And once he speaks up, the whole crowd starts yelling, get out, get out, get out. So courage begets that one guy standing up changed the entire direction of the thing. Courage begets courage, and cowardice begets cowardice.
Yeah, courage.
That's right. I agree with you. And I'm just going to say this real quick. Before the grievance studies stuff dropped, Peter had contacted me on DMs, and I said, I got your back, my friend. And I got your back too. Just want you to know. I'm back to back with you, and I won't yield.
Excellent.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, courage begets courage, and there is no courage without fear, right? So it's not courage if you don't have something at risk and you're not worried what could happen. So when you feel that fear, when something's happening and you know you should speak up to our listeners, and you're feeling a little afraid, well, what about this? What if this happens? Well, maybe I shouldn't. That is what courage is. That is the moment of courage. Doing it anyway, living up to your spoken commitments, to save our civil society is what courage is, right? Defined. Can we go to the other half real quick, just to make sure that they're keeping us accountable to the other half?
This was great. Both, first of all, Mark Gleason and Rick Rapetti, thank you so much for letting us be part of this. We were just spectators for the most part of this, but this was amazing. Rick actually recommended Cynical theories to me a couple of weeks ago, and he said that I know you're my student, a friend, and this is a must read for you. And I have been going down this rabbit hole, and thank you so much for writing this book. I'm halfway through it now, and it's amazing. And it's important, and it gives us fuel to have these arguments, have these debates, have these discussions on our podcast, on which I hope you come on one day, and secondly, Mark Pellegrino and James Lee, both of you, thank you for letting us be part of this. This was illuminating, and I think it's super important that more and more people listen to you and hear what you have to say.
Very much agree.
Thank you.
Very good. And by the way, if you want to just, if you're not a soldier on the front line of the battle, right, and you are listening to the podcast, I bought 6 hardcover copies of Cynical Theories and gave them out. I gave one to my buddy here, who was going to buy one anyway, but I wanted him to have a hard copy.
I
for
bought
me.
the Audible copy. I listen
right.
when I'm running.
So you don't have to. When you have that uncle and cousin and aunt that you're going to see at Thanksgiving, and you want them to, and you want to do something, right? But you don't want to be out there on Twitter making mother jokes along with James. You don't have to. He's made all the mother jokes for you. You can buy the Cynical Theories. I actually gave it to not only Rick, I gave it to my father, a few other friends. I gave it to a college student going off to college. I said, look, you're going to hear a lot of nonsense at college, and when you do, I want you to just turn to the proper chapter and get the story of what's really going on. So this is a war of ideas, and these books capture these ideas, and so you don't have to be a frontline warrior. You can have the courage to confront the people in your life, not even confront, educate, ask them to read ideas and give you their opinions on them. Right? You don't have to confront them at all in order to have them start thinking about these things differently. So that's just a little note for everybody at home who wants to do something. They're all asking, what can I do tomorrow? And I think that's a great way for us to wrap up with James. James.
Yeah, they can give it to your mom.
You're already doing that, though. So, so I guess, James, that's my question to wrap up here. What can we do tomorrow, right? I'm inspired by the podcast. I wake up tomorrow and I'm like, I want to be like Mark Pellegrino and James Lindsay. I want to change the world, or my little corner of the world. What's the best way I can do that?
It depends on, this is a question that's a very hard question to answer because everybody has different circumstances. And I take that very seriously because I can't ask somebody to stand up foolishly. And nobody should stand up foolishly. The courage doesn't mean rashness, right? If you go back to the Greek virtue ethicists, courage doesn't imply rashness. Bravery is somewhere in that sweet spot in the middle between cowardice and rashness. So you can't be rash, but you do have to resist. So I listened to a Christian pastor talk about this a number of months ago, and it was really inspiring. And he says that you have to ask yourself, this is a Christian kind of mindset, but what are your gifts of the Spirit? What do you have that you can bring to the table? And if you have the capacity to stand up and run your mouth on Twitter or run your mouth on social media or start writing, blogs or start writing articles and getting articles published, or people who can do that, or you have the ability to start making a podcast or put out YouTube videos, or how you can organize these things, or maybe you have financial resources and you can do things like buy copies of books and distribute them, or you can, whatever it happens to be, you can create a newsletter for people that and try to get them to go to the websites that not just mine, but everybody who's putting stuff out there. You can direct people to resources. You got to look into yourself and figure out, what is it that I can contribute? What's the maximum amount that I can contribute to this project? What are things that would be useful to be done? So a lot of this is, I don't want to be the guy who solves everybody's problem. I can't solve everybody's problem. This was very stressful last summer where people were like, oh, this is getting into, or even before last summer, this is getting into, law. I don't know law. I don't have time to learn law to get to the nitty gritties. Why don't you take the material I'm learning and then figure out how to apply it in some way within law? Even if all you can do is talk to one other person as a friend to make sure that they know they're not crazy, that's something. But if you can apply it within your field or within your affinity group or wherever it happens to be, that's even better. There's a lot of opportunity that people with different sets of skills have. Somebody contacted me today and said, I have this crazy story. Who can I tell this story to? And I'm terrible at exposés. I know I'm terrible at exposés. I organize them badly. I don't get all the details right. I don't present them well to where it stirs people up. So can you become a hub and a network that starts figuring out ways to gather stories and direct them to people? I recently testified in the state legislature. A lot of people saw that of New Hampshire when they were trying to forward a bill to prohibit critical race theory. Well, I wouldn't have done that had there not been a woman who, Dr. Carlin, for those of you who know who she is, who literally started doing all the legwork. Maybe you can become the kind of organizer who links people together. Like, hey, here's this school board meeting that's happening by Zoom. Let me try to find people. Maybe James will show up to the school board meeting. Maybe somebody like Chris Rufo will show up. Maybe Mark will show up. Maybe who knows will show up. Let's try to get some people together. Let's try to coordinate and say, we want people who are speaking from the heart. We want people who are telling a story of harm, a testimonial harm. We want people who know the theory to show up and testify to these things. That kind of stuff isn't happen without some, and I hate to use this term given the circumstances, but without some kind of community organization. Maybe you're an organizer. Maybe you're a networker. What skills do you have to contribute? You don't have to be out there having the argument. I can't do exposés. Chris Rufo, for example, does excellent expose work. I can't do it. So I have to give that off to somebody else, and that's fine. Maybe you aren't a great arguer. You don't have to argue. Maybe you can network. Maybe you can finance something. Maybe you can create just an organization for people who go out to dinner once every 2 weeks and feel sane for an hour and a half. And what does that network? What tendrils grow out of that to the next to build the next thing? You have to start thinking in terms of what capacity do I have, and orient yourself toward this does have to be resisted. I should educate myself to what degree I can. I still always think of this video, this Puerto Rican guy, he said on the video, he's talking and he's talking, it's like pretty casual slang language. It's not exactly like he sounds like he's a leather patched Oxford professor, we'll say. And he's like, you think you can trick us? You think you can fool us? You think we're not reading James Lindsay on the new discourses? You think we don't know? If maybe it's you're sharing the information and getting it out there and creating networks and hubs and things like that. Those things are huge, but you have to be oriented toward resisting and educating yourself about what's going on and realizing why this matters. I think more than anything, and then telling other people. If that's one thing. If you tell two people and those two people tell two people, and then all of a sudden we're on our geometric growth curve.
That's right.
And if you can connect, if you have connections, those networks are going to be everything. If you have connections, work your connections. If you know a politician that needs to get some good advice, start seeing if you can't get them in touch with people who can give that good advice, whether it's somebody like myself or somebody else. Those are things that everyday people can do right now. You don't have to do anything to sit back and think, how can I contribute? How can I contribute, even if it's just in my 3 feet of influence, as they say, my friends, my family, etc. Start thinking about, also bigger steps. Somebody's going to have to be on school boards to get the activists out. Maybe it's you. Somebody's going to have to run for city councils to push the activists out. I know you don't want to do it. I don't want to do it either. Maybe it's you. If that's a thing that you've ever had even the slightest idea that you might be interested in or good at, or that you care about, maybe it's you. Start thinking in terms of that. If you're looking at your school, your kids' schools or whatever, or your workplace, maybe it's time to start thinking of yourself in a way as kind of a potential plaintiff. Start digging around. Is there a lawsuit here? Are they compelling speech? Are they violating civil rights? Is there and then that's something those things that's risky. That's big. That's actually more courage than most people have. So there are lots of things you can do, depending on what you think you have to offer. And remember, though, wisdom it lies in finding out that maximum line between cowardice and rashness, where bravery and courage really lie. So think about it in those terms too. Don't act foolishly. Don't overreact, because if you blow it, you'll get taken out in an effective sense. So try to act smart, but also don't cower, because we said it before. That's the most important thing to remember. Courage begets courage, and cowardice begets cowardice. So
awesome.
Try not to be a coward.
Well, it's important to remember that, I think it's Jerry Pournell's iron law bureaucracy states that in any organization, he uses NASA, the rocket scientists do everything in the beginning. And now you need a rules committee and you need governance. And the actual rocket scientists don't like that. They want to go do rocket science. So you get bureaucrats who know nothing about rocketry in charge. And over time, everybody in charge knows nothing about rocketry. And the organization is about something completely different. And so I say that to what you said was because the last thing I want to do is join a school board. I have better things to do in my life. Well, what happens? The people who have nothing better to do in their life join the school board. And we end up with, I get the school board I deserve then, right? So people do need to say, this may not be the thing I want to do, but it's important to do because it has impact to me. And maybe I need to make a different decision than I did before and consider going for school board and make my own small dent in the world. Ayn Rand said that someone asked, do you have an obligation to just argue every single point? She was talking about communism specifically when it comes up and trying to convert everybody around you. And she said, no, you don't have that obligation. But the guidance she gave was, you do have an obligation when your silence will be taken as agreement. You have an obligation to at least say, I disagree with that. And you don't have to have reasons. You don't need to argue because they can give you a bunch of reasons. You can say, yeah, I still don't quite agree with that. And you can hold that position eternally and forever. But you have an obligation to make sure that you don't just sit there silently and everybody else says, we all agree, right? Because that is where your cowardice kind of has a maximal impact. So I would give that to people, that you can just say, wow, it doesn't sound right to me. I don't quite agree with that. And just hold that line eternally, no matter what reasons they give you if it doesn't sound right to you.
For many people, that's a huge step forward, like especially in academia, when all those woke voices are at any kind of little town hall or whatever it is, a convocation or, whatever commencements, whatever, all these different speeches, and that ideology comes out, and like a lot of the heads are nodding, and a lot of them are just quiet, and nobody says, I don't agree with that. They're afraid to.
Well, your moral obligation is when your silence will be taken as agreement, make sure you register your disagreement. And if you can find a way to do that.
Let me tell you the easiest thing. I just realized this. I've been talking about this for weeks, and it struck me as an answer to what people can do. This is literally the easiest thing that you could possibly do to resist this. It may not apply to everybody. It's, again, that gift of the spirit kind of thing. Okay, so here's something you can do that's got massive impact if you do it well. And especially if you network with other people and do it. Think about the organizations that you might be giving money to. Look and see if they're woke. Stop giving them money. Stop giving woke organizations money. The college you graduated from, that you're an alumni donor for, that ain't your college anymore. It's got rabies. It ain't your dog. That was Brett Weinstein's analogy. When your dog gets rabies, it ain't your dog anymore. It's a danger to itself and others. Stop giving woke organizations money. If you have a smidgen more courage, tell them why you're not giving them money. If you have even more courage, try to network with whether it's alumni donors or other donors that you might know, and do this not, as kind of an informal, I hate to use the word union, but as an informal union, where this just happened, by the way, it works. This just happened at the University of Texas, which got pushed on one of these things is its school song or something has a history of racism or rooted in racism or some nonsense. And the alumni and some of the other major donors stepped up in kind of a group and said, well, looks like you're not getting a whole lot of money that you used to get. And all of a sudden Texas says, let's evaluate this on its merits instead. And now the song is still there and it's going to be kept as they evaluate it on its merits. Stop giving money to organizations that have gone bad.
Excellent.
Amen.
Very good. So, Mr. Pellegrino, I know our listeners are already familiar with you, but could you just state your website and/or coordinates that people can follow you online? I know the Guardian Project is one, but where should people follow up with you online if they want to hear more about your projects?
They can go to my Twitter, Mark R. Pellegrino, or for the fuzzy nice stuff, you can go to my Instagram. Mark Ross Pelly. It's checkmarked, so
I wasn't aware there was any funny nice stuff. I've missed that entirely.
Yeah, people think there's two different people on my Instagram and on my Twitter. It's like the demonic version of me is on Twitter, and the nice guy is on Instagram.
Is that Planet Pellegrino your website also?
No, Planet Pellegrino. Lou is up here watching.
That's
Lou. Yeah, she's awesome, man. She consolidates all my tweets and she.
Yeah, I thought that was your website. That's Lou doing that for you. That's great, Lou.
She's a mastermind.
Yeah, James needs a Lou. Okay, so James, can you please just give us your coordinates? I know New Discourses, right, is your thing, but where can people learn more about you via podcast and via website?
Sure. Yeah. All the podcasts they're kind of on all of the platforms, but they're all housed at least on newdiscourses.com, where all of my New Discourses stuff is. There are also New Discourses social media accounts for, they're usually at New Discourses for whatever it is, Twitter for sure, Facebook, most of the major platforms New Discourses has a presence, has a YouTube channel as well. And then I personally am at Conceptual James on the vast majority of the platforms, and I kind of do have a Lou. So a
Cool.
lot of my other social media might be not actually much more than an aggregation of me on my Twitter.
Ask Neos too. Ask Neos too.
But yeah, you can find me on any social media you want at Conceptual James and at New Discourses.
Okay.
And just a shameless plug, I drove all the way from LA to Pittsburgh for my job, and most of my listening was New Discourses. So that was 8 days straight of listening to New Discourses. So
I
it's a
now
great
understand the dent in your sanity.
show. Now you know.
Yes, right. Mr. Niaz, you want to give us your coordinates as well to
Sure.
The other half.
So
usher us
you
out?
you can find us at the other half on Twitter, and that's the with a TH3, the number 3, other half, and our website's the same, theotherhalf.com, which is THE, the number 3, otherhalf.com.
Now, if you're the other half, does that make us the better half? I'm just asking. This is a question you can maybe clear up for me later. Well, very good. Thank you so much for your time, gentlemen.
Let me plug
yep.
mine also. My website, which has a lot of my material, rickrapetti.com, easy to remember.
Very good. And of course, we are Level to Power. And as always, you can change your level, and you can change your life, and you can change the world. So thank you for being at Level to Power.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for your time. James, that was great. Mark, as always.
Wow.